Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Bellamy. I'm a senior advisor here at CSIS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to this Spotlight on Kenya discussion, Spotlight on Kenya assessing risks and opportunities in East Africa's largest economy. When we first considered staging this event, we obviously had no idea that it would occur in the wake of a court decision that not only jolted Kenya, but sent a shockwave around the world. We assumed, we hoped, we would be surveying a relatively calm post-electoral landscape in Kenya. We thought that some 8 weeks after the August 8 election, elected officials would be settling into their positions at the national and local level, and that we might have a clearer picture of the challenges facing the new government and of possibly also of some policy directions. All of that, of course, changed on September 1st. Kenya is now again in a pre-election mode with a new date for elections set for October 26th. There is more uncertainty on many fronts today than there was prior to the August 8 elections. And our panelists are going to attempt to deal with some of that uncertainty today and to evaluate political and economic risks that have grown sharper in recent weeks. And as they do this, I'd like to urge panelists not to relitigate the Supreme Court decision that annulled the August 8th presidential election. It might be an interesting exercise to wade into that discussion, a debate that is turned somewhat ugly and perhaps ominous in Kenya itself, but it would take us away from the main issue before us today, the central question being, what next? What now? The court's decision is what it is. If the Constitution and the rule of law are to be respected, Kenyans must act quickly to organize new elections. This would be a difficult task, even in the best of circumstances. Given the short deadline and the degree of polarization and mistrust that exist today, it will be a difficult task, if not an impossible one. In keeping with the original intent of this conference, we do not want to focus exclusively on the near term. We also want to look further out to envision future political, economic, and security trajectories for Kenya. This longer view reflects the fact that Kenya, regardless of what happens in the next several months, is likely to remain an important player in Africa and an important partner for the United States. The reasons for this are clear, well known to most of you in this room. Kenya is East Africa's most advanced economy, an economy driven by a dynamic private sector. Kenya's institutional infrastructure, its universities, its financial institutions, its health sector, its legal system is among the best in Africa. As a security partner of the U.S., Kenya is very much in the forefront of the fight against al-Shabaab terrorism. Nairobi was for many years, and perhaps still is, the largest U.S. embassy in Africa. And perhaps most importantly of all, Kenya matters because of the commitment of so many ordinary Kenyans to democratic governance, however imperfect and fragile it often is, at a time when so many other nations are drifting towards authoritarianism and strongman rule. Of course, these attributes cannot be taken for granted. A prolonged political crisis, or one that results in serious damage to the institutions of Kenyan democracy, will reduce Kenya's strategic importance. Conversely, a credible election, reaffirming Kenya's commitment to democratic governance and the rule of law, will elevate Kenya's standing and importance. We have two excellent panels today. Kate Almquist-Knopf, Director of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies and former USAID Assistant Administrator for Africa, will moderate Panel 1, which will focus on the political and security outlook in Kenya. Jennifer Cook, Director of the Africa Program at CSIS, will moderate Panel 2, focusing on the economic and business outlook. I'm very glad that we've been able to assemble a strong economic panel this morning, which will examine Kenya's rapid growth in recent years, its development progress, which I think some would argue has not been rapid enough, as well as the outlook in Kenya for business and investors. I'd like to extend a special word of thanks to Jennifer Cook, her staff, Richard Downey, Katrin Hager, for their work in organizing this conference. A word of thanks also to Tony Carroll of Manchester Trade for his help. And Jennifer and I were talking just before we came in and reflecting on how at this time, and as at so many other moments, we miss the presence of Joel Barkan, one of the most insightful, most authoritative, and most congenial voices on Africa and on Kenya that many of us had ever known. Joel was a senior advisor, a senior fellow here at CSIS for many years. He departed suddenly 4 years ago. So, Joel, we'll try to do our best today to keep up to the high standards that you set and maintained here for so long. I'm going to turn this over now, Kate, to you, and I'll become an interested note taker here in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you all this morning. We have a very distinguished and expert panel here. So I would like to give just the briefest of introductions, since I think everyone has full bios in the handout. And as Ambassador Bellamy said, we're going to look on the political and security aspects of what's already happened and what's to come for Kenya. And to help us do that, we have Ambassador Johnnie Carson, who is a senior advisor to the president of the U.S. Institute of Peace, but of course known to all of us as our former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, former National Intelligence Officer for Africa, former U.S. Ambassador to Kenya, and many other things. So Ambassador Carson will give us some broad perspective on why Kenya matters, what the developments say for democratic consolidation in Kenya and for the continent, and help us to put things in perspective. Then we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Career Singh Oy. He is the legal advisor in the Executive Office of the Deputy President in the Kenyan government. He previously served as the litigation director in the Katiba Institute, a rule of law specialist at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and also the founding director for the Center for Minority Rights Development, which is a Pan-African nonprofit organization. He's had a distinguished legal career, and we're pleased that he's here to share with us an insider legal perspective on the events around the elections in Kenya. Following Dr. Singh Oy, we'll turn to John Tomaszewski. John is currently the Regional Director for Africa at IRI, the International Republican Institute, where he leads and provides overall strategic guidance for IRI democracy and governance programs throughout all sub-Saharan Africa. JT previously served as IRI's Resident Program Director for East Africa and Deputy Resident Coordinator Director for Egypt and for South Sudan. And he'll provide us some perspective on the August election and what we should be watching for now in the rerun to come next month. And then we have Lauren Plock-Blanchard, who also brings us a wealth of expertise and knowledge, specialist in African affairs with the Congressional Research Service. She provides nonpartisan analysis on African political, military, and diplomatic affairs in her capacity there to members of Congress, congressional committees, and congressional staff. She has also previously served in East Africa and in Kenya, specifically on constitutional and democratic development issues. So we're pleased that Lauren will bring us a perspective on security-related matters surrounding the elections and what we might expect, both the rerun and following, since we've all been very concerned with both peaceful and credible elections and what that portends for Kenya and for the region going forward. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Ambassador Carson to kick us off. We'll take some opening comments from everybody and then open up into a discussion.
Kate, thanks. I don't know whether I can be heard or not. Anyway, Kate, thanks very much for the very, very kind introduction. I am pleased to be here this morning with all of those who are interested in Kenya as a country and interested in democracy and the values and principles that underpin it. I was asked to say a little bit about the importance of Kenya to Kenya and Kenyans, the region, and to the United States. In many ways, Ambassador Bellamy set the stage for that with some of his comments. I am only going to mention very briefly a number of things that make Kenya important, and then I'm going to move into some remarks about democracy in Kenya. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind, and there should be no doubt in anyone's mind in this audience, that Kenya is, has been, and probably will continue to be in the future the most important country in East and Central Africa and the Greater Horn region. There are, as Ambassador Bellamy pointed out, a number of things that make this true. Its strategic location makes it the transportation, the financial banking and insurance, and commercial and IT hub for the entire region. It has the most sophisticated communications and IT sector in the entire region. And it is, and should be no surprise, that the rebranding of Kenya as Africa's Silicon Savannah is driven by the intellectual capital and power of its people. Kenya today is probably the mobile banking center of Africa. And on a per capita basis, no other place in the world uses more mobile banking than that country. A reflection of its communication and IT skills as well as its banking and commercial skills. But it's not just M-Pesa and mobile banking. It's also the creativity of the young Kenyan intellects who have created things like Ushahidi, the crowdsourcing app, which is used not only in Africa, but in fact has been used from Haiti to Pakistan, and in fact modified in some instances and used around the world wherever there are humanitarian or refugee crises. But this is one example of the dynamism to be found in just one sector. But it goes beyond just communications and banking. It is, in fact, the artery, the transportation artery for the entire region. The people who live in neighboring countries, whether it is Uganda or Rwanda or Burundi, rely probably for 60 to 70% of their imports and exports on the transportation hub that Kenya is today. But I would also argue that it goes far beyond that as well to say that the people of Goma and Bukavu and Kisangani in the central part of the Congo rely more on Mombasa and Nairobi than they do on Kinshasa and Port Matadi. This is a country which is extraordinarily important in terms of its transportation networks. I would also say that it has been a strong friend, partner, and ally of the United States since its independence. Probably our strongest partner, our most reliable partner as well. Almost every other country in the region, whether it is Eritrea or Ethiopia or Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, and even, I might add, very friendly Tanzania, have all had their breaks and upheavals and challenges with the United States, where relations have been broken, diplomats have been kicked out, embassies have been closed, people have been hurt and killed. But in Kenya, the U.S. has always had a reliable base and a steady partner. It is no surprise that Ambassador Bellamy points out that it is, in fact, the largest U.S. mission in all of Africa, superseding both that of Cairo and Pretoria. We've had a strong presence and a strong alliance there. And I suspect that's one reason why we shed blood together there on August 7th, 1998, when our embassies were destroyed. But they're also important to the United Nations and the international community as well. Kenya is the only country in the southern hemisphere that is the headquarters of a major UN regional office. No other part of the world has anything that is as big and as established a part of the international community as its offices in Gigiri. So it's important, and they remain important and will remain important as long as we continue to jointly work and fight against issues like terrorism in the region as well. It is important, its economy is important, its people are important, and it will remain important as well. Let me say something now about what I really came to talk about, and that is democracy and Kenya. Democracy is a very messy business. And as a result, democratic progress is never smooth, linear, or rapid. Progress is frequently contested, disrupted, and even stalled before it picks up steam again and moves forward, as it usually does in places that are committed to inclusive government. We know this very well from our own history of democratic progress in this country. We are now seeing this play out in Kenya itself. Today's discussions about Kenya's 2017 elections may in fact be a bit premature, since the most important race in that contest ended in controversy, was annulled, and has not yet been decided. The courts have ordered a rerun which will take place, we hope, on October 26. There are, however, very real questions about whether this race will take place on the 26th and whether both parties will take part when it does occur. Raila Odinga and the NASA coalition as we all know, have accused the Election Commission, the IEBC, of rigging and gross negligence, and has said it will not compete in the next contest unless there are changes in the Election Commission and the way the last elections were run. Ryla has said quite clearly, and I quote him, "You cannot do the same things the same way and expect different results." You know something? He's right. The Election Commission is facing a very uphill task of organizing a new election on short notice under a clear mandate from Kenya's Supreme Court to improve the electoral process, iron out the previous errors and glitches, and run the election according to the law and the Constitution. That's not a bad thing for those who believe in democracy. The OT Morpho, the French company that provided the electronic voting kits, has said it will be stretched to reconfigure the 40,000 kits by the end of October. There are also concerns that a constitutional crisis may erupt if the Election Commission is not able to actually run an election according to the timetable laid out in the Constitution. All of these issues have raised questions about the state of Kenya's democratic progression and how these elections compare with the country's two previous elections in 2007 and in 2013. Despite the uncertainty about how this election ultimately turns out and the very serious challenges that remain, I think that we have seen positive movement in Kenya's democratic progression over the last decade and a half. Certainly since 2007 and 2008, important and ongoing constitutional and electoral reforms to develop a democratic system that works for Kenya have in fact been initiated and implemented. The 2010 Constitution is a reflection of that. We have also seen devolution of political power and control move from the center to the provinces. And this certainly has increased popular political participation. We've also witnessed a decline in presidential power that has sometimes been used unwisely, not only in Kenya, but in many other African states. We've seen a decrease in electoral violence in a country that has always seen a certain amount of violence. We have seen a growing willingness to take electoral disputes to the courts, as we are witnessing today and as we have witnessed in 2013. And we have seen the emergence of a stronger and more independent and courageous judiciary, willing to assert its right to defend the Constitution and to play its rightful role as a co-equal branch of government and a counterweight to the executive. We've also seen a more engaged civil society actively working to curb hate speech and political excesses by politicians. We've seen a civil society out promoting peaceful elections. And we have seen a civil society willing to try to hold officials accountable. And we've also witnessed improvements in some of the progress and mechanics that are essential to holding good elections. I'm referring to the use of the biometric voter registration and verification systems. All of these things reflect a degree of democratic progress. But none of these things have prevented the current political imbroglio and impasse that we see occurring today across Kenya. But in my estimation, the 2017 election thus far represents a significant improvement over 2013, when the Kenyan courts were probably not sufficiently confident and independent to say that the country needed a second round. And while there was certainly some violence surrounding that election, this election also, for the time being, represents a significant step forward over the 2007 and 8 elections, where we saw some 1,300 people killed and the country nearly thrown into a violent civil war. We don't yet know what the next step will be in Kenya. Some of my colleagues will, on the panel, provide some answers, and I hope I'll get a chance to weigh in as well. But let me stop by going back to where I began in this process and say that democracy is messy, and Kenya's is no exception. The most important thing we can do is to continue, all of us, to support good governance, the rule of law, and the fundamental values that underpin democracy, constitutional rule, and democratic institutions. And this means holding free and fair, creditable, and transparent elections that are regulated by rules and norms that everyone should follow to the absolute greatest degree possible, and especially those members of the IEBC who've been entrusted to manage the process. I'll stop.
Thank you, Ambassador Carson. You've given us exactly the overview we hoped for in terms of placing Kenya's importance front and center and what's at stake here for the nation, for the region, and beyond. I think introduced the key facets of democratic consolidation and progress that Kenya represents. It is a controversial decision, and it was unexpected what happened, but in fact, the Supreme Court ruled, and so far, all parties have said they're respecting the decision. Whether we'll see everyone participate or not remains an open question, and how this will play out going forward. We're pleased now to have Dr. Singh Oy to give us an insider legal perspective on how this looks from inside Kenya. While we celebrate the judicial independence and the broader implications of that for the continent, it is messy, as Ambassador Carson says, and it is challenging, and we welcome your view, Dr. Singhoi.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you, Ambassador Carson, for the incredible sort of exposition of where we are in Kenya. And thank you for this very important conversation. I will begin sort of from where Ambassador Carson left off, which is that it is true that Kenya adopted a new constitution in 2010. When you examine this constitution, the key hallmarks of it are a very broad and expansive Bill of Rights, devolution of power from the center to 47 subnational units to ensure greater inclusion in resource governance and distribution of resources. And third, like Ambassador said, there is a sense in which the executive is highly circumscribed. Now, Kenya's constitutional architecture leaves the selection of the president and head of state to the people through an election conducted every 5 years by an independent election management body, the IEBC. The IEBC registers voters, it manages the actual voting process, it counts the votes and tallies them for purposes of ascertaining which candidate has attained the constitutional threshold of 50% plus one, as well as 25% votes in at least 50% of Kenya's 47 subnational counties. Courts come in only to determine electoral disputes arising from the election. And like we have been told and have heard, the election of the president that took place on the 8th of August was annulled by the Kenyan court. It's important to appreciate exactly what the court said, even though we will not relitigate the matter, as Ambassador Bellamy has said. The rule of law that the court propounded must be appreciated for what it is. When you read the judgment of the majority, paragraph 301 says the following. It says that no evidence, or rather there was no evidence, that the process of voter registration, voter identification, the manual voting, and the vote counting process were not conducted according to the law. The system thereafter, meaning the transmission system, went opaquely awry, and whether or not the third respondent received a large number of votes becomes irrelevant. What is the court really saying? What is the legal policy? What is the legal principle that the court is propounding? It is a policy that says that under Kenya's constitution and law, if the electoral management body, IEBC, fails to transmit results of a presidential election in strict compliance with the technological roadmap set up in the law and using the stipulated forms and formats, then notwithstanding that there were no breaches of the law in relation to voter registration, voter identification, actual voting, and the process of voter counting at polling centers, that election will be invalidated. You will agree with me that that is a very, very exacting standard. It is a standard that says that the critical indicia of a good election, namely proper voter registration, which happened in Kenya and ensured the enfranchising of 19 million people, up from 15 million people in 2013. The process of voter identification, which in the Kenyan context was done by way of a biometric system. So we had a biometric voter identification, which registered about 97% success. The actual voting itself, which was adjudged to have been undertaken in an environment devoid of intimidation and in a peaceful environment. And the counting, which took place across the country, from Mandera to Marsabit and elsewhere, across 40,883 polling centers, peacefully. It says that that entire process might well be good. But if the transmission of the results using the system that has been agreed is problematic, then the entire election is invalidated. It is my submission that that is a very worrying standard. It is a worrying standard because democracy essentially is about the vote. It's about people braving the sun and rain for hours, marking a ballot paper, depositing it, and having the ballot paper counted and the result declared at the polling center. That is democracy. What this ruling has done, in our view, is to make it almost impossible to deliver a credible election based on this exacting standard. We must argue here that our Constitution itself is very clear in terms of what is required. What is required is that the election be conducted using a simple, open, transparent, verifiable system. There is no constitutional obligation that, in fact, that system must in any way be based on a technological interface. However, it is also my submission that what has taken place over the last couple of years is that because of what I call the trust deficit amongst the political players, there has been an over-legislation of issues in relation to elections, which has created a regulatory burden, the implementation of which by the electoral management body is nearly impossible. Given where we are as a country, the question is, how do we move forward? The Constitution is very clear, and the Constitution actually does have a roadmap in this case. The Constitution envisions that it is possible for the court to invalidate a presidential election, which it has done. The Constitution further envisions that a rerun of that election should be conducted within 60 days. We argue here that there is no crisis at this point. All organs of the state are in place. They are fully functional. Parliament, both the Senate and the National Assembly, is in place and capable to transact legitimate business of legislating for Kenya's progress and stability. All the 47 county governments, members of the county assemblies are in office The president, too, is in office. It is our view that there is no lacuna nor diminution of power in the current administration. Article 134 and 142 of the Constitution essentially provide that the term of this administration will only end when the new administration is sworn in. So there is no lacuna as such. The security forces continue to protect citizens, their lives and property across the breadth and length of the country. It is important, in conclusion, to say here the following, that it is my view that the uncritical adulation of the opposition leader Raila Odinga by the international community has made his conduct to lack any sense of proportionality. What he is proposing in the context of this challenge is, for instance, the unleashing of street protests and the mobilization of dissent in our streets. There has been calls by his supporters for a war of irredentism and secession urged on upon the country by pro-NASA thinkers, including their own highly respected economist, David D. It is therefore important for the international community to support Kenya in ensuring that there is no unconstitutional change of government, and that in fact, the letter, the spirit, and the provision of the Constitution are adhered to, including during this crisis, because we believe that the Constitution, in fact, is capable and has sufficient mechanisms to be able to address the challenge that we are in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Career. You've helped unpack the Constitution for us, especially those of us who are not steeped in Kenya's legal and government framework. And you've posed an important question, which is the standard too exacting? The Supreme Court said process does matter, and your question is it the right focus for the court to take such an important and impactful decision? JT, it seems that the bar is really high for the IEBC in conducting this rerun. Can Kenyans trust it to run to be competent, to be an impartial umpire of this election going forward? What can we learn from August?
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me here. Just really to sort of set some context, I think we should talk a little bit about what has occurred even before the 2017 election. You have to go back even prior to the Constitution to 2007, 2008, a failed effort to pass the Constitution even before that, which has led to a really polarized political environment in Kenya. This rematch between Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta was much anticipated, well thought about. The election challenge that Odinga launched in 2013 and his inability to be victorious has led to a lot of animosity in the country in the intervening years from those who are his supporters. You could check the social media timelines in the period after 2013, and people would say, yeah, there was peace, but there was no justice. So what we see out of this 2017 court ruling is perhaps a sense of justice amongst supporters, right or wrong in terms of how the court ruled. There is a good portion of the population who feel that, yes, actually, my vote can matter. Now, of course, Kenyatta's supporters believe their vote matters, and it really mattered, but it didn't get counted, as Dr. Career has put out, and that's a very legitimate point. But the other side of it is that Odinga's supporters certainly felt robbed in the last election. Some would say he was robbed in 2007, more so. And we saw the violence that occurred after that election, which really, I think, there was violence in 2013, but it took a different form. It certainly manifested itself online, social media, in the media, in the way politics was done on the ground. But there have been a lot of changes in Kenya. And of course, the electoral reforms that have occurred in the run-up to the 2017 elections were vigorous. They dealt with issues like party hopping, which was the old Kenya standard. You run for a nomination, you lose, you hop to another party. This really diluted the ability of the party to be important. But a lot of good things happened in this 2017 election that came out of actually some of those reforms, one of which was the proliferation of independent candidates. There are other good stories. We have thousands of candidates, more than ever, have run for office. Part of that has to do with the fact that devolution is working, that people know that there's a value in being a local elected leader, that you actually have influence, authority, power, the ability to make a difference. Of course, for some, it's an opportunity to eat a lot, especially drawing on that $4,000 a month salary as an MCA. So clearly there are good motives and bad motives, but it did motivate a good number of people to run in this election. The number of independents also demonstrates the ability of Kenyans more increasingly to pick up on their own and run for office and not necessarily have to depend on parties. I think we'll see a continued trend of that. It's questionable whether that is good or bad in the long term, but it is an interesting element from this election. The other important thing that came out of 2017 was the rise of women, which clearly has not broken the glass ceiling. They've made some cracks. There's no woman president. There was no woman vice presidential candidate. But certainly we had women governors, two. We had three, so that's right. And a number of women senators and a number of women MPs. So we have a movement of increasingly women who can be elected to office, who can make their way through the system. The key here now, though, is to make sure that we build on that as we go into the next electoral period. Just to go over a few things that occurred in this election, Jubilee won big overall. They won pretty much big majorities in Parliament, and that will be very important as we talk about the way forward. Kenyatta will have a stronger, if he wins again, we'll have a stronger Parliament in which to exact his reforms and the much talked about Jubilee Manifesto. In many ways, that was the election message. Re-elect us, re-elect myself and my friend William Ruto so that we can finish our work. We have work to do, we have to finish it. They certainly have a parliamentary majority now that can provide that. Should there be no court cases that take some of those members out, and we're seeing a rise in that as well. 2013 results, comparing that to what Kenyatta did, he did better, and I think there is very little dispute that Kenyatta won the election in terms of votes in 2017. By estimates, it looks like he'll do well again. But this does not negate the fact that the election had problems, and while a candidate may have received a certain number of votes, the process had serious flaws. First, when you look at the way that the petition was filed, NASA didn't dispute the issue of results. In fact, they focused less on the quantity of votes and rather the quality of votes. And it was quite brilliant in many ways, because instead of talking about and debating whether or not Odinga got enough votes, they just focused on the fact that these results were coming in and there were a lot of unanswered questions. And in fact, the constitutional timelines in which to collect evidence, present that evidence, even for the IEBC to meet that evidentiary burden to submit documents in time, made it very difficult for people to really analyze the forms 34A, 34B, 34C. In the dissenting Supreme Court opinion that came out, it was very clearly communicated that the court did not do a full audit of all of the forms, and that is a big contention that Jubilee has put forward, saying, listen, you've made a ruling, but you didn't even look at all the documents. Of course, those in NASA camp would say, well, the IEBC called an election and didn't read all the results forms. So there's a lot of information out there in the political space that people are using. I would say that the other big thing that comes out of this is that the devolution process continues. And as Dr. Career, as Ambassador Carson put it very clearly, while all of this is going on, while we're scurrying around and talking about this presidential election, there are 47 county governments that are sitting and doing work. They're doing development. They're dealing with issues of budgets. They're dealing with a bloated wage bill. They're dealing with nurses that can't be paid, doctors that have issues showing up to hospitals. You have an education system that needs serious reform, and all of these things are being talked about on the ground. In many ways, Kenya is moving forward, and you'll see that in the Council of Governors. You'll see that in the Senate induction training that occurred this week. So as we talk about a number of things that are going on at the presidential level, remember one thing, that devolution did transfer a significant amount of power to the ground, and that power is at work as we speak, making serious decisions. An interesting story, Governor Mike Sanko, governor of Nairobi, reports a doubling or tripling of revenue collection, right? Within 15 days. We had a lot of thoughts about Mike Sanko, Senator Sanko, former MP Sanko. You remember the guy who got kicked out of Parliament for wearing sunglasses and for other things? This is an interesting and very important thing. Of course, where the money is spent, we haven't gotten there yet, but he's collecting more money. And that revenue collection is a big challenge under devolution. County governments struggled to find ways of getting revenue out of people, ensuring that it's not stolen in the system. Even if you look at what Sanko's been able to accomplish, it's only out of 15 out of more than 100 revenue streams. So we see county governments trying to adapt, trying to fill their coffers to meet important needs. The Senate, which is a new body under the 2010 Constitution, in 2013, all of the older MPs, like James Orengo and Boni Hawale, the bullfighter, they all went into the Senate and thought that was going to be the place where all the action was going to be. The Senate, it turned out, was an institution that seriously struggled from the beginning in 2013. In many cases, they would put funding bills up for discussion. They would go over to the National Assembly and be totally wiped away. The president would sign it, in many ways undercutting the Senate. We've seen a lot of those senators now, because they see they really can't do too much, jumping now over in this election to be governors. But the Senate still plays a very important role in the devolution process because of its ability and its mandate to represent counties at a national level on national issues. So it'll be very important as we watch the Senate take shape, how this will play out, not only during this election as they consider the funding request that has come forward from the IEBC and pushed through cabinet just the other day, and how the National Assembly will work with the Senate in the years ahead, because that is a key relationship that did not come to fruition in the way it should have, or as was envisioned under the Constitution. There were even debates by some in the National Assembly to get rid of the Senate. It's too expensive. Are we the upper house or are you the lower house? I know these all sound like maybe petty questions or questions that don't really matter, but they do. They do for devolution, because in order for effective national level policymaking that impacts counties, the Senate has to be a strong body. Again, it's important to note that Jubilee has a majority there. So we'll see in both bodies how that plays out, no matter who wins this next election, Odinga or Kenyatta. I'd like to talk really quickly about the cost of elections. I know we'll talk about economics in another panel, but these were the most expensive elections in Kenya ever. We cost about $480 million, about 48 billion shillings, with about 413 million going towards personnel, procurement, materials, et cetera. What's interesting is that if you go around and start asking people, have you been paid? Some of those payments still haven't been made. There are still poll workers who have not received a paycheck. There are still procurement vendors that have not received money. So where'd the money go? That accounting is important. And again, Parliament will play an important role there. It's the most expensive in Africa, elections. Those elections, about $25 a voter. You put that up against Ghana's 2016 vote, which is about $12 a voter. Tanzania, $5 a voter. Kenyans spend a lot of money on elections. It's a money-making operation. The money that goes into the economy is used for a whole host of things. Food providers, vendors, There's even a report that came out that in the period leading up to election and following election, food prices rocketed in local markets. Not necessarily because commodities became more expensive, but just there was less food, so the market went up. And as a result, you saw really the poorest people really face some serious challenges as they went into this election in terms of affording basic goods. The cost of the October 26 vote is projected to be about 10 billion shillings. The IEBC says they need about 12 billion. It's important to note as we talk about who's right, who's wrong, how this all plays out, that President Kenyatta and the cabinet have been responsive to this request. I mean, to only go 2 billion off, we've seen in many African governments when they're asked to fund an election commission, when they're asked to fund an election commission, this, it's usually much lower. So this is very encouraging. Some of the worrying signs that have come out of the Supreme Court opinion that we should think about that will play into how we move forward is this question of caretaker government. It's pretty convincing that this is clearly a strategy by NASA to find a way of running out the clock on this election. I think Dr. Career is very correct when he talks about the issue of secession of the Constitution and how the power of the president remains intact. Of course, the question of the 60-day rule in which elections should be held, if elections are delayed further, what will happen? But I would expect that this caretaker government argument will be brought up even further more and more as we move forward. Finally, criticism of international observers is something we should talk about. It was a highly politicized issue. I think IRI is one of the organizations that observes elections around the world. We learned some lessons. I think other partners who were in the field learned some really important lessons, one of which is we need to think very clearly about how we make statements and how we are perceived and be a little bit more mindful about the role of local observers and the issues that are being raised by the opposition and the ruling party in the election. Thank you.
Thanks, JT, and thanks especially for drawing out some of the aspects of devolution that were significant from this electoral process and will continue to be significant irrespective of the outcome of the presidential election going forward, as well as raising some important questions that I know the audience probably wants us to get to in our discussion period on the role of outsiders and how we can see the dynamics going forward. What kind of turnout even can we anticipate on October 26th? So Lauren, perhaps you want to take a stab at that, but also explore for us some of the anxieties around the security sector and its role in the elections, its role in the past, what we saw in the immediate aftermath of the August contest, and what we might be looking at going forward for October.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you. Thank you all for coming out to talk about Kenya on a Friday. I'm going to talk sort of very briefly about the run-up to the elections, concerns about violence, security developments, and security developments after the elections, and then what we're looking at going forward. There was a lot of anxiety before the elections about what might happen. Obviously, the violence that followed the 2007 elections is never far from anybody's mind in Kenya, although the political dynamics were different. We had a very polarized environment leading up to this election, and of course the stakes were very, very high. This was opposition leader Raila Odinga's last run, so he said, at the presidency, and obviously the president and deputy president wanting to return for a second term. We did see some pre-election violence, and we saw, I believe, more hate speech and incitement than we had in the run-up to the 2013 elections. You had areas, particularly in North Rift Valley, where you had some serious insecurity, and you had the use of hate speech by politicians to garner votes, to intimidate, and not nearly enough prosecutions of those incidents. I think we now stand at almost 300 cases that the National Cohesion and Integration Commission has brought forward around hate speech. I'll talk about some of those in the context of sort of what we have going forward. But those are important, particularly, again, in the aftermath of the 2007 violence and Kenya's sort of political history of political violence. I think you probably are all aware of some of the security developments right before the election. Just over a week before the August 8th election, we had the murder of a top IEBC official, top election commission official, who had been the acting person in charge of the technology. That murder is to date unresolved, and we don't have a lot of clarity on where the investigation lies. That incident caused a great amount of concern among the opposition, civil society, and the population in terms of what it meant. There were rumors that he had been tortured for his passwords, some attempt to access the servers. There was also a question of whether or not the murder might be an effort to intimidate election officials or others in the lead up to the elections. You've had, I think, at least one election official at the local level murdered after the election, and a number of other still unresolved deaths. You had, I think maybe probably most concerning in the aftermath of the election, at least 24 deaths in post-election violence after the results were announced. Those were in predominantly opposition supporting areas, both in Kisumu, in Western Kenya, and then in Nairobi, and parts of Nairobi that are predominantly, again, opposition supporting. And most of those deaths have been attributed by people in those areas and by human rights groups to the police. Those investigations by the Independent Police Authority in Kenya, I believe, are ongoing, but I have seen no sign yet of prosecutions or movement on those cases. I think it's important to think about concerns about the petition that went to the court. There was quite a bit of concern among the donor community, among observers, that the opposition would not take its case to the courts if it lost, and would instead take its case to the streets. And what would that mean, particularly, again, in light of Kenya's history? Before the 2010 Constitution was passed, judges were appointed by the president. The court were seen as heavily politicized, and there was not a perception that the opposition in challenging an election would have any chance of a successful case. I think that was probably, we would all agree, one of the many reasons why you had things devolve the way they did after the 2007 elections. So the changes and the independence brought to the judiciary the creation of a new Supreme Court, a very clear mechanism for challenging elections in the new 2010 Constitution was a very important development. It was a very important development that, again, diplomats, donors, civil society stressed as we had the election results announced, and it was clear that the opposition was not happy with the result. I'm going to sort of turn briefly to where we're going from here. You have, I think, as all of our panelists have talked about, a very polarized environment going into the next election. You have a lot of concerns about the Election Commission's ability to hold the election on time and to make the changes necessary that the opposition, civil society feel need to be made to make this next election more credible. You have new incidents of hate speech and incitement. I will flag in particular cases like one sitting MP, ruling party MP, who after the election told a county in central Kenya that a manhunt is on for the 200,000 who did not vote and for the 70,000 who voted for that other demon. This was on his Facebook page. It is still on his Facebook page. And he has been arrested and is out on bail. He has also been, I think, announced today as a top official in the re-election campaign for the president and the deputy president. This is concerning, these incidents of hate speech as we go forward. The ability of the courts to prosecute those cases, the ruling party has clearly indicated by putting him in charge of the campaign, that was okay. So, I think you're going to see a lot of intimidation of voters going forward. It's going to be a big question how that affects turnout. How does that affect turnout in ruling party strongholds? How does it affect it in opposition strongholds? How does it affect turnout in areas that are undecided? There was a great amount of concern before the August 8th elections about peace around the elections. This sort of, is there a choice between a peaceful election and a credible election? You saw in some areas, Nairobi, urban areas, people sending their families home for the election. Did that affect turnout? You had, men, where I was, in Rift Valley, you saw more men voting than women. Women maybe sent home, staying home. That wasn't the case in all areas, but it was in some areas. So how is turnout affected by concerns about violence in this election? The role of the security forces. Kenya's police were implicated in, I believe, over 400 deaths in the post-election violence in 2007. There have been a number of very significant reforms in the police service since that time, but you still have, unfortunately, all too often, incidents of accusations of extrajudicial killings by security forces. And the post-election deaths were, I think, one of many indications of that. So how do police comport themselves as the elections approach again? Earlier this week, we had sort of a back and forth between the judiciary and the police in terms of threats against the judiciary. Obviously, there have been a number of threats and statements made against the Supreme Court and the justices who ruled for the majority. And the judiciary put out a statement, I believe Tuesday or Wednesday of this week, raising concern with those threats and raising concern with the fact that the police had not acted to investigate or arrest anybody for those incidents. The Assistant Inspector General of Police responded very quickly that the police have been providing security for the justices, for their residences, and for the courts. That statement made no comment about investigations of threats against the judiciary. So I think there is a question right now about the police role in protecting the judiciary, protecting civil society. You had a number of two civil society groups, prominent civil society groups, who were threatened with deregistration right after the elections. Those cases, I think, are still sort of somewhat outstanding. One of those NGOs, AFRICOG, there was an attempted raid by police on their office. Those cases raise concern. These are to the Kenya Human Rights Commission and AFRICOG were two very prominent civil society organizations in the 2013 petition against the election result, and they remain very, very outspoken. They are part of a civil society coalition that has been raising significant concerns about the election. There was a perception that those raids and those threats to deregister those groups were an effort to intimidate or distract those organizations from preparing a petition for the 2013, for this election. So those concerns remain outstanding. And all of these questions about security, the role of security forces, the role of the judiciary, they raise questions for donor partners going forward after this election, no matter how the result turns out. As Ambassador Carson, Ambassador Bellamy mentioned, Kenya is the United States' top strategic partner in the region. It is one of our largest security assistance recipients, and it is a top counterterrorism partner. 20 years ago, we had the US Embassy bombing. We have a very, very strong and robust counterterrorism relationship with Kenya. 6 years ago, Kenya deployed into Somalia, where they are part of the AU mission in Somalia, and they have several thousand troops there. Kenya has seen a significant increase in terrorist incidents in the country since then. Yesterday was the 4th anniversary of the Westgate Mall attack, and a number of very, very deadly attacks since then. You see sort of ongoing terrorist activity along the Somali border and along parts of the coast. Right before the election, you had not quite a state of emergency, but something just short of it, declared in several of the counties, Lamu County, Tana River County, and Garissa County, I believe, and increased security presence, increased military deployments in those areas. The partnership between the United States and other key donors, the UK, the European Union, and the military and the police are very, very critical partnerships, and they are partnerships that are challenged by some of the allegations against particularly law enforcement in Kenya. So all of these are things I think that we are looking at as we go into the next election season, or as we are in the midst of the next election season and going forward. I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. I think from our panel we can appreciate some of the depth of complexity of the environment and the context coming out of the contest in August and previous years and going into the rerun in October. We can appreciate that the stakes are very, very high for the nation of Kenya, for the region, and for us and other partners of Kenya. And the implications of what happens are profound. And it's not just the end result that matters, it's also the process and how that result is arrived at. So I'm going to open it up for a few minutes of conversations, questions from the floor, and then we'll turn back to the panel for some reaction and comment. I'm going to take a group of questions, and then we'll give the panel a chance to respond before we break for the next session. Please do introduce yourself, and the microphone will come to you, and we would appreciate everyone being succinct. Please.
Good morning. Thank you for a very interesting panel. My name is Deirdre Lepin, University of Pennsylvania. As an anthropologist, I was rather struck by the absence of the word ethnicity in this discussion or the name of any ethnic group. And given that we talk about hate speech, we talk about polarization, we talk about opposition, but we kind of avoid this other constellation of terms. And yet, given the history of Kenya from Oginga Odinga and Jomo Kenyatta down to the present, I mean, isn't this really the history that we're now seeing unfold before us? And to what extent can we see these arguments about the electoral process a proxy for the bigger argument, which is whether or not all ethnic groups in Kenya are being accorded adequate justice, participation in the socio-economic development of the country, and they share in the social, economic, and political capital of the country?
Okay, great question on ethnicity and inclusion. Yes, sir, please.
Good morning. I'm Learned Dees, a longtime democracy watcher working for the State Department. I have an observation and a question. The observation has to do with the electoral process in Kenya compared to the rest of Africa over the last 25 years. Equally divided and politicized societies in Ghana and Nigeria have definitely made progress where the electorate in those countries has confidence in the electoral body. In Kenya, not so much. And there, I would argue, hasn't been progress in confidence and competence in the Electoral Commission and the actual organization of elections. Would you agree? And if so, why does Kenya have so many problems getting confidence and competence in the Electoral Commission?
Okay, I had a hand here in the third row, and then we'll come here, and then I'm coming to the back over there.
My name is Josephine. I'm from Kenyatta University. Sorry that I walked in late, so I'll just comment on the last ones that I heard. Talking about the independence of the various institutions in Kenya, and particularly the role of civil society and the police. I think Lauren raises very important points that could partly be explained by the comments raised by the first speaker, the polarization along ethnic lines in Kenya, and that how that plays out in the elections. And if you look at violent elections in Kenya, you can trace them back only to 2007. Because before that, the elections had not been really violent. Why does 2007 become so important? And what happened in 2000, how does what happened in 2007 explain what is happening today? I think that's an important question for us to consider. I did hear somebody mention that in the elections, I think it was you, John, NASA did not question the numbers because apparently those, I don't know if I had you right, that those did not have a question. But there are questions raised about non-existent polling stations. And what happens to those, and how are the votes accounted for? I think it's important that when we are looking at the issues around Kenya, we do not forget 2007 versus 2002, where the community, everyone came together to vote for change. And what happened thereafter that may have produced what we are seeing today. And if we're talking about the independence of the judiciary, I mean, it's been played all over what the president said, I'll be finishing soon, concerning the independence of the judiciary. And when it rules against the sitting president, the reaction and the backlash on the judiciary, that becomes very important. And the fact that observers were there and were not able to raise some very key questions in their statements has left a very bitter sense of the role of observers in elections in Africa. And I've been to many elections and seen the same thing. I think when, John, you say that it's time to discuss that afresh, that is very, very important.
Thank
I think
you
I
very
have to
much.
stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. You put a number of issues that all deserve a good deal more discussion right here very quickly, so we can take a few more from the other side, and then we'll turn back to the panel.
Thank you. I'm Tom Wolfe. I work for Ipsos, a market research firm in Nairobi, and I do work with political polling. Dr. Career raised the question, or made the suggestion, that the judgment of the Supreme Court set an unrealistically high standard for future elections, which I think raises the question as to whether this current situation we're in could go on indefinitely, with every rerun being petitioned and every petition resulting in a nullification. So we could have 100 more reruns. I just wondered, as a constitutional lawyer, if that is at least a constitutional possibility. And related to that, I saw, I think in the last half day, the Chief Justice issuing a statement in response to the President's remarks at State House yesterday, when the President characterized the Supreme Court judgment as a judicial coup, when he said the Supreme Court would not hesitate, if the rerun did not meet these requirements, to nullify that one as well. So that kind of feeds into the hypothetical and a slightly more practical. And one other quick thing. In the aftermath of the Court of Appeals affirmation of the High Court decision in the Maina Kiai case on the process of vote tallying and announcement and declaration, that in fact the results of the 34 A's at the 40,000 plus polling stations would be final, and at least they would be final by the time they got to the 290 constituency tallying centers. And it was only, the obligation of the chair of the IBC was only to add those up in Nairobi and declare the total, but not to raise any questions about those figures received in the 34 Bs. There was a widespread expectation, I think, as most people know, that the media or anybody else at these 290 constituency tallying centers would put those results in the public domain, since they were final. And this was notwithstanding the warning that was given by the Cabinet Secretary for IT, Mr. Mushero, that the media shouldn't do this. But the media came back a week before the election and said, wait a minute, the court and the Court of Appeal has said these things are in public domain. And yet not a single media house reported even a single one of the 290 constituency level results. And Victor Bwire, the vice chair of the Media Council of Kenya, was on KTN a few days after the election, and basically he admitted that warnings were given to the media houses and they were intimidated, and that's why nobody did it. But just finally, the question where we started, or one of the questions we started, if there's a clear result in the runoff, in the rerun, will the losers accept defeat? And what will that mean for governance in Kenya going forward if they do and if they don't? But, and I say, related to that, does anyone have any insight whether the Kenyan media are prepared this time to publicize these results as they come in at the 290 constituency levels? And would that contribute to an acceptance of the results, especially by the loser?
Okay, we have a lot of important questions here. I do want to take one or two comments from this side of the room. Yes, sir, please. And then we'll turn to the panel, and everybody will be very brief.
I'll make this question brief. My name is Andrew Nearing. Lauren, this is directed more towards you. You just discussed some of the violence and everything going on and voter intimidation. If you could just speak towards some of the opposition's violence, if that exists, and if you could elaborate on that for us, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. We have just a few minutes for some responses and further insights from the panel. I'm going to go in reverse order and ask that you not try and be comprehensive in addressing every question raised, but hopefully as we work our way down the table, we'll touch on most of them and then be able to take into the coffee break any further conversations. So I won't summarize them in the interest of time, but Lauren, why don't you respond? 2 or 3 minutes.
All right, well, I'll start with that question about opposition violence. I don't have a breakdown of the number of hate speech and incitement cases in terms of opposition versus ruling party, but they are equally, not equally, but political leaders from both sides have been accused. Some very prominent political leaders, particularly in North Rift, who were involved in some of the incitement cases have been brought forward, released a number of times. There was quite a bit of concern about the potential for opposition violence, particularly if they didn't like the result. I think you saw the heavy police response in part based on a concern that there would be such violence. There is a perception that these protests, particularly in Nairobi and in Kisumu, you get burning of tires in the streets, potential looting. Those were all concerns. I haven't seen cases of opposition supporters involved in the post-election violence being brought before the courts, but I haven't followed all of the cases. And there was a prominent opposition candidate, who was brought forward with Moses Kuria on this recent cases. Oh, absolutely. But when I'm talking about security forces, opposition doesn't have security forces. A number of other questions. I think all of the panelists will have some thoughts on this. I wanted to talk about the role of observers very briefly, and I think the challenge, this is something we can have an entire panel conversation on. I was one of the observers. The problem, I think, for election observers is that they prepare very long, often numerous reports. Several groups did pre-election assessments and put those out. All of the major organizations released statements and gave press conferences 2 days after the elections occurred. That was before the results were announced. Those statements were all identified as preliminary, but of course that is the press conference that counts for journalists. And those 15-page statements get boiled down into 3-4 words sound bites. And so I think a cautionary tale for observers going forward is to watch what those words are, those soundbite words, credible. Very few election observation groups use the term free and fair anymore. Credible and transparent, these are the words, peaceful, that are more often used. But I was amazed by the number of media and other coverage of their findings that said election observers found the elections free and fair. No election observation group, none of the major groups actually said that, and all of them said the process was ongoing. A number of them obviously released post-election statements, post-results statements, but I think that there is a lot of sort of soul-searching going on within the international observation mission community on how they can do things differently. Obviously, there is a lot that election observers can't see, and the statements that were made 2 days after elections that everybody focused on were primarily focused on voting day processes. How did the election, did the polling places open on time? Were things peaceful? Election observers love to congratulate Kenyans for standing patiently in long lines, as though that's a major challenge that they don't do any other time. But those statements, if you go and read them, actually did raise a number of the concerns, outstanding questions about the voter register, concerns about the procurement processes, some of the pre-election violence, obviously questions around Chris Msando's death, among others. As we go forward, there will be a role for observers. I know the EU is observing. Some of the other organizations will be returning. Carter Center may be observing. And they will have a real challenge to try to look at some of the issues that were raised by the Supreme Court. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Let me just address a few things. First, the issue of numbers. So NASA, let me restate the point. NASA did not focus on whether or not Odinga got more votes than Kenyatta. Yes, there were numbers involved. I'll just read one key issue area that was discussed, and this is a glaring thing that the Supreme Court called, quote, a mysterious puzzle in its ruling, that the declaration of results was made before all the 40,833 Form 34As have been received, and that random scrutiny of the 4,299 Form 34As showed widespread discrepancies. Also that there were 41,000 that actually existed. So clearly there were numbers involved in the case, but it's important to note the strategy. And this is strategy that I think other opposition parties on the continent will now take up when they file a petition. They won't go out, I won, he lost, I got more votes, he didn't. It's now going to be process. There is a precedent here, and it's something to think about. Ethnicity, huge, huge issue. Very important to point out, we thought that there would be more ticket splitting in this election. There wasn't, frankly. And down ballot, the only person who really won in some of the ticket splitting counties was Odinga. He collected a few extra votes here and there, opposed to some of his candidates. He also performed better than most of his candidates. So that also could explain some of it. Not all of his candidates were necessarily maybe the best ones, or I think there's still some analysis that has to be made. But this is clearly still the game, right? You amass your tribal coalition in one side, and you have your tribal coalition on the other. We've heard things thrown around in Kenya like tyranny of numbers, and you get your group and my group. I think let's talk about 2022 then, because I'm really interested to see how that plays out. You have a promise theoretically made to Deputy President William Ruto that the Kikuyu community will get behind him, and the Kalenjins and the Kikuyus will continue the Jubilee reign for another 2 terms. That's an interesting prospect. I think there's some distrust in those 2 communities, and there's questions, and you'll see the media report on that. I think the other key question is who follows Raila. He doesn't have a very good successor. Mudavadi, does he have the backbone and the strength to do it? Who else then? So there's a lot of questions going into 2022 to see how this ethnic game plays out. I would argue, though, that at the county level, that is changing. Devolution is actually helping people to focus more on the performance of a governor, right? And whether or not that governor is stealing money, building a mansion, creating tax for dead bodies, Kabogo did that in Kiambu, then whether or not you're a Kikuyu, Luya, Luo, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that devolution has a positive impact there. And it's something that should be pushed upon, and I think as we move forward. Also, I think the fact that you have a number of upstart independent candidates will also play an important role in saying, I'm a Luo, running against a Luo, but you're really voting on me because I have a better campaign, better message. Yeah, it still comes down to patronage and money and things like that. As I said, elections are an expensive game. This plays into it. The other issue here is the one of the media. Media has to answer some questions. If we have brave politicians and brave candidates and brave civil society groups, we need to have a brave media. It is not an excuse to say that you were intimidated, therefore you didn't do it. Okay, now of course there were a number of media reforms that led up to this election that created some very high bars if you messed with breaking the law, so to speak, on the media, because the fees were raised in one of the media reforms that occurred after Westgate, where, you know, at one point in the security bill, they said, we won't put dead bodies on the front page of the newspaper. If you do that, you'll pay a price. And they raised these prices very high. That did scare the media, right? I'm a reporter. I don't want to necessarily spend that money. Maybe I won't report. But there is no excuse for voluntary blackouts of things that are going on. Just one quick example. In Mathare, that initial first night, as the election results were rolling in, what was happening on the ground was a bunch of looters who were basically creating trouble. The security forces come in and deal with that issue. On social media, because the media is not reporting it, on social media, there's discussion back and forth over what's happening. And then it rolls. Oh, the Kikuyus, the Luos, back and forth. You can watch it. It's all there. So the media needs to do a better job of digging deep and not just reporting information that it's fed. Thanks.
We just have a few minutes. I know there are many issues and comments on the table, but if you'll pick and choose the most important.
All right. On ethnicity and inclusion, just to emphasize again that I agree entirely with what JT is saying. Devolution has made a difference. By constitutional design, we understood by 2007 that we had an inclusion problem. And how do you deal with that? You deal with that by ensuring that all communities, sort of, including minorities, become participants in the Commonwealth. And so you give them, you give subnational units certain authority, certain power, and resources to be able to run their affairs more or less. And that in itself, in the long term, should be able to address the problem of inclusion. The other way we do it by constitutional design is you de-emphasize the role of the president, sort of, so that it's not, it must not be a member of your community, for you to feel that you are included in the polity. And so, but that has not happened yet. In the short term, it appears as if, the position of president is the position that everybody must go for. And if your community is not represented, then, you run the risk of exclusion. So there are still devices that we need to look at in terms of legal and policy and regulatory devices to be able to address some of the issues around, around ethnicity. How do you get confidence in the electoral management body? You do not do that by ensuring or by ensuring that every time there's a mistake, every time there's a challenge, you replace the entire electoral body. This has happened at the behest of Raila Odinga a year before the election, before 2017. There was a huge movement to replace the previous IBC. In the end, government accepted that proposition. A new IBC personnel was appointed. But what do we see? We see a continuation of that narrative. You cannot ensure confidence of such an institution if every time there's a challenge, the answer is replace them. You cannot do that. And then I agree with Josephine. I think we must continue to view what happens in Kenya from the lens of what happened in 2007. And I think what's happening today continues to tell us in government that there is still work to be done. There's unfinished business. There are issues around the truth, justice, and reconciliation process that, that started in 2008, which still need to be resolved. There are issues around land reform that also require still some kind of resolution. So yes, that lens still continues to animate some of the decisions that we need to make going forward. In terms of the independence of the judiciary, I think we must really laud what President Kenyatta has done. Very few leaders in Africa who's gotten the mandate of the majority and whose election gets invalidated would be able to accept a decision of a court of that nature. But what have we seen? We have seen a president who says, I accept. I don't necessarily agree with it. Okay? And that is his democratic right, to be able to voice his criticism regarding the judgment. Okay? And so I think the Kenyan judiciary is independent. I think government continues to support it and support the imperative of independence, but it does not escape the criticism that some of its decisions, in fact, have created opportunity and incentives, for actors who are not necessarily interested in stability, to capitalize upon, And so it links up to what Tom Wolfe is saying, that in fact, because of this situation, it is possible, it is indeed feasible, and the Constitution does anticipate it, that there is a potential for endless petitions, okay? There is a possibility for endless petition. And where does this take us, except the route of chaos and confusion, and anarchy? At what point do we say enough is enough, okay? And so I think those are issues that we still need to grapple with. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Career. The panel's done an excellent job touching on nearly every question that was raised. It leaves, Johnnie, for you to wrap up and also take the one outstanding question of will the loser accept defeat?
Let me answer that one first, and I'm going to go quickly through. If the loser genuinely believes in democracy, he will seek a democratic solution. And that democratic solution is to be found in a court of law or some kind of mitigation process. It is not to be found in the street, and it is not to be found in violence. Democracy has nothing to do with violence, and elections have nothing to do with violence. And those who promote violence around elections are engaging in anti-democratic behavior. Several quick points on some of the things that were raised. Both sides have made intemperate and unhelpful remarks since the court's decision. They have emboldened their supporters on both sides to do things which are anti-democratic and do not reflect well on leading up to a peaceful process. Again, if they support democracy, then they need to make statements that reflect it. There is absolutely no reason why the president can't say, I disagree. But there is something to be concerned about when he calls the courts crooks and when he talks about a judicial coup d'etat. It is not helpful for Raila Odinga to make statements that suggest that if he doesn't get his way legally, that he is going to disrupt the electoral process and perhaps be unable to control his people from going to the streets. It is acceptable to be in disagreement. It is one thing to encourage disagreeable, insightful, hateful, and dangerous activities. There is a way. Presidential contests in Kenya and still in many parts of Africa are about personalities and not about policies. In Kenya, like in so many other places, elections and election building blocks are based on ethnicity, region, religion, and that continues to be the case in many places. It is breaking down because of devolution, and it will break down more as Kenya becomes a more mature and sophisticated democracy. Kenya's election commissions and commissioners, unlike maybe those recently in Ghana under Mrs. Osu, and before that, Afari John, and in Nigeria under the last two elections, Professor Jega. The thing that is different in Kenya is that the election commissions and commissioners have reflected Kenya's sometimes dysfunctional politics. They have also been seen to be untrustworthy, too partisan, and even in the last cases of the last 2 or 3 commissions, susceptible to corruption. No one would suggest that Professor Jega from Nigeria or Afari John from Ghana or Mrs. Osu, who is now the election commissioner there, and some of the others are in any way corrupt. These are people of great integrity. And sometimes that trust and integrity has been absent in Kenya, and the people on the commissions have reflected the greediness and the dysfunctionality that characterizes some of the politics in the society. And that's why you have some serious changes. And I would argue that South Africa has had extraordinary election commissioners as well. And a number of countries do. It's not just the ones I've named. It's been absent in Kenya because of the political environment that has been at play. 2002 was a seminal election in Kenya. We didn't talk about it. And it was an election of great dramatic change. It was the end of the Moi era, and it reflected a desire to move the democratic process forward, which it effectively did. But it had two, and we have to recognize this, we had two Kikuyus running against one another. The reform candidate was Mwai Kibaki, and the person who was standing beside him and behind him and giving him the greatest amount of legitimacy with respect to change was none other than Raila Odinga. They were aligned together in 2002 against Mr. Moi's hand-picked candidate at the time, a young, inexperienced, new to politics, wealthy Uhuru Kenyatta. And so it helped to dissipate the amount of friction. It's also a misunderstanding of what happened in 2007. It's a misunderstanding of what happened in 2007. The violence that nearly tore Kenya apart was not between Raila Odinga's forces in the West. It wasn't Luos and Luyas who were fighting against the government of Mr. Kenyatta, Kibaki at the time. In fact, it was Kikuyu against Kalenjin. It was the Kalenjin who were angry and upset about the land grievances which have not yet been resolved in the West, in the Rift Valley. It was the Kalenjins, some say under the leadership of the now Vice President, who stirred the ethnic and land pot. And it was the then young Mr. Kenyatta who was called upon to bring resources and money to the table to get the support of the Mungiki sect to go out and counteract this. Now, they have formed an alliance today, in large part for reasons that I will not go into here. But 2002 was different. 2007 was different. 2013 was different. And I will come back to the original premise that I made at the very beginning of all of this, is that despite the court challenges that are there, and the issues which remain unresolved and which we haven't talked about really, about where things go, Kenya has made democratic progress. Kenya has made democratic progress. 2010 Constitution, devolution of authority, reduction of presidential power being among those things. Greater civic engagement and participation out there. And we've seen this across the board. The real question for Kenya, and there are several, is whether the leaders, whether the winner will do so with humility and the loser will accept and bow out with grace. That is the democratic process. But it is also, as I said here, we should not condemn the courts for enforcing the law. And those who are involved most directly in the democratic and political processes must have confidence that the process is creditable, transparent, and legal. And the courts did say all that you said there, but I was struck, and I couldn't quote it directly, but the court also said there will always be irregularities, administrative errors, and intentional and unintentional mistakes. No elections are perfect. But if these irregularities become too great and too glaring, the court has an obligation to its citizens and to the nation and to the laws and the Constitution to annul elections and run the process again in the name of democracy. That too is there as a part of the process. So again, where do we go? And the where do we go really depends on the level of democratic commitment by the leaders to accept that democracy and elections have no place alongside of violence.
Okay, there's no better note to end on than that, so please join me in thanking our panelists, Lauren, JT, Dr. Career, and Johnnie, and Dr. Carson. What are, Mark, over to you.
How are you? Tony. Good, thank you.
Good job. That was fun.
Quick coffee break and back here in 10 minutes. So we say 10 minutes, 10 minutes.
January 17, Iraq time, marks an unrecognized milestone. The United States has been bombing that country almost continuously for a quarter of a century. What has the U.S. been trying to accomplish with all these air attacks? And what has been the effect? The air attacks have occurred in 5 phases. But to fully understand this history, we need to go back to the beginning of Airpower Theory. The tactical use of air power sought to defeat enemy air attacks and to strike enemy ground forces. But the horror of World War I led some air power advocates to propose a new idea: use air power strategically to strike at an enemy's economy, population, and political leadership, thereby winning wars without costly ground campaigns. The massive conventional air campaigns in World War II, in Korea, and in Vietnam produced many positive results, but they did not by themselves produce enemy surrender. When Desert Storm began, some in the Air Force hoped that new technologies would force Saddam to surrender from an air campaign alone. Others saw air power as part of a joint campaign working with ground and naval forces.
And an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
Air attacks did make a major contribution to winning Desert Storm. But as was true of previous adversaries, Saddam did not surrender to air attacks alone. Iraqi civil society and Saddam's government proved to be highly resilient. After the war, Saddam used his own air power to suppress insurrections and stay in power. So the U.S. instituted no-fly zones in the north to protect the Kurds and in the south to protect the Shia. These were successful in protecting the threatened groups, but no-fly zones turned out to be major military operations. Maintaining them year after year required continuous suppression of Iraqi air defenses and periodic attacks on the Iraqi military.
I take the fact that he develops weapons of mass destruction.
The U.S. launched a new wave of air attacks during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. These attacks looked a lot like those of 1991, with 2 changes. The first was attacking Iraqi leadership directly, called decapitation. The second was called shock and awe, hitting a society so hard and in so many ways that it becomes disoriented and collapses. Both failed. Saddam evaded attack, and although Iraqi society suffered, Saddam did not surrender. In other areas, air power again made major contributions. During the long Iraqi insurgency, air power played a useful but secondary role because insurgencies produced only a few and then very fleeting targets. Many air missions were taken over by UAVs. Their patience and precision matched the nature of counterinsurgency. Over the years, a conventional wisdom has arisen about the use of air power. Decapitation is hard to do, but can sometimes be successful if there is a small group of charismatic enemy leaders. Strategic air attack can cause a lot of destruction, but its ability to win wars on its own is unproven. Battlefield support can be very effective, but it needs a viable ground force, U.S., allied, or local, to win battles. In 2014, President Obama pledged to disrupt and ultimately destroy ISIS. To do this, the U.S. appears to be using air power in all 3 ways. Results so far are again mixed. We've killed several ISIS leaders, but others have replaced them. We've killed a lot of enemy fighters, but so far, ISIS has been able to replace them, though with some strain. We provided air support to the Iraqi and local ground forces with some success, but the rollback of ISIS's territorial gains still has a long way to go. What will the next 25 years bring? Air attacks have become a central element of U.S. involvement in Iraq and the broader Middle East. When we are changing regimes, we attack governments and civil society. When we are suppressing terrorism, we attack individuals and cells. When we are supporting partner militaries, we provide close air support to their troops. So where our policy goes, there will go the air campaign.
This century will feature a major shift in economic and geopolitical power toward Asia. China, India, and increasingly Southeast Asia have joined Japan and Korea as global stakeholders. But Asia's peaceful rise is threatened by fractious maritime disputes. Its waters are more contested than any on Earth. The South China Sea is home to the most complex disputes over water and seabed in the world. Clashes over ownership of the Paracel, Spratly, and Senkaku Islands could destabilize an otherwise booming region. And from the Sea of Okhotsk to the Indian Ocean, overlapping claims prevent Asian states from accessing desperately needed offshore resources. A lack of transparency about claims and how they are being advanced has only made the region more dangerous. How can states negotiate boundary disputes if their claims are not clear? How can civilian and military ships safely navigate if they don't know where international waters lie? How can countries avoid accidental conflict if they are unsure of the disposition and intentions of their neighbours' forces? The Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative was founded on the idea that sunshine is the best disinfectant and the most efficient policeman. The initiative is a complete resource for understanding Asia's complex maritime issues. AMTI monitors reclamation, island building, and construction on disputed rocks and reefs. It unpacks the web of legal and historical issues driving maritime disputes, and it seeks to draw attention to the claims being made and point out where those claims overstep international law. On this and many other fronts, transparency is desperately needed in Asia's waters. Join the dialogue. Visit us at amti.csis.org.
Protecting the homeland is regularly identified as the top priority of U.S. missile defense efforts. This mission is dependent upon a global network of sensors and interceptors, including the Ground-Based Midcourse Defense System, or GMD. The formal prioritization of homeland missile defense, however, has not always been reflected in the budget. Today's ground-based interceptors, or GBIs, were originally designed in the 1990s and to some extent still use technology from that era. Today's system is able to defend the nation from certain long-range ballistic missile threats, such as from North Korea. As missile threats grow, however, today's defenses could be outmatched unless steps are taken to improve reliability and capacity. By the end of 2017, only 44 interceptors will be deployed between Alaska and California. The site at Fort Greely, Alaska, was designed to hold up to 100 interceptors. But reliability and capability are equally important as numbers. The Missile Defense Agency is currently developing the redesigned kill vehicle, drawing upon advances from other recent missile defense programs. Space-based sensors and improvements for tracking and discrimination will also help. The United States should also consider other solutions, such as directed energy, transportable GBIs, or an underlay of other interceptors for key areas. Entirely new types of threats to the homeland are also emerging, including cruise missiles and boost glide vehicles, which require different solutions. None of this is easy, but continued focus will be necessary to outpace these threats.
Currently, India ranks 54th on the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index, more than 20 spots below manufacturing competitors like China and Malaysia. This is a major challenge for Modi's Make in India initiative. For example, India's truckers report that 15% to 25% of travel time is actually spent waiting at the heavily enforced state border checkpoints. They pay as much as $1.1 billion a year in bribes to state officials. The main problem is that India does not have a single national market. Its 29 states and 7 union territories each have their own system of sales taxes. As a result, internal borders look more like international ones. The version of the goods and services tax sitting before Parliament isn't perfect, but it will cut down on transit time for goods, paperwork for businesses, and could add 0.5% to annual economic growth. A seamless national tax environment will help Indian commerce flow more quickly.
I believe in strong alliances, clarity in dealing with our rivals.
What is the very last
and I take the oil.
Populism, border walls, retrenchment, and protectionism. While foreign policy is often overshadowed by economic concerns, contrasting visions of America's role in the world have played a major part in the recent election cycle. This contentious campaign season saw some of the basic tenets of U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II called into question. Does this heightened acrimony over key aspects of U.S. international engagement reflect trends toward isolationism? It may seem unprecedented, but it is in fact not new. Today's controversies are continuations of debates that have lasted for decades. While support for the nation playing an active part in global affairs has remained strong since 1947, public opinion on key components of U.S. international engagement, such as defense spending, has waxed and waned over the last 70 years in response to economic trends, military interventions, and domestic priorities. In the first decades of the Cold War, America was committed to international engagement as a part of its strategy of containment against the existential threat presented by the Soviet Union. The U.S. experience in Vietnam, however, created an aversion to overseas military engagements that lasted from the late 1960s through the 70s. During the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union led the U.S. public and policymakers to again question defense spending levels, foreign aid, and forward military presence. Many thought the limited interventions of Desert Storm in Kosovo would serve as models for future military operations. Then came September 11, 2001. Our response to the events of that day have largely defined contemporary American foreign policy since. First came the long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Their unsatisfactory outcomes left much of the public and policymaking elites disillusioned with large-scale military engagements. The result of that disillusionment has been an increasing reliance on small footprint forces for a variety of contingency operations, including in the global war on terror. At home, the most severe
economic
recession...
outlook. A perspective from Kenya, from the international financial institutions, and from a U.S. business perspective. I think it was said at the outset, Johnnie Carson and Mark Bellamy laid out very well kind of the importance of Kenya politically, as a security partner of the United States, as a driving economy in East Africa. In the last few years, I think when I first came to CSIS in 2000, there was a lot going wrong in Kenya in economic terms. Today, when you talk to U.S. businesses across a whole spectrum of sectors, Kenya is a place of interest and appeal and rising dynamism. I think Kenya has always been an outward-looking economy, unlike some of its neighbors, so very commercially driven. The boom of the last 15 years has certainly manifested itself in Kenya in the financial services sector, in IT and innovation and the innovation hubs within Nairobi. I hadn't heard the term Silicon Savannah before, but it's exciting in that way. In the energy sector, Kenya with potential energy finds in fossil fuels, but also leading in renewables and wind and geothermal energy. And I think importantly, at the heart of this has been kind of a much more strategic thinking by a technocratic class within Kenya that has made some important reforms. When you talk to people in the power sector, people often point to Kenya as a place that has taken some hard, difficult looks at building a sustainable power sector, and that is paying off. So there's a lot of excitement about Kenya. There are still a lot of challenges on the horizon. Among them, how does this economic growth also fuel expanded employment opportunities, and does it expand them fast enough to keep up with a growing population? The education sector, obviously still enormous needs for reform and to build a kind of a workforce for the new economy. And then the income disparities and land issues that kind of lie at so much of the grievance that we've seen crystallize in recent elections. So we're going to turn to our panel here today. I won't go into long biographical detail because you have their bios in your packets. But we're going to start with Samuel Mwale. who is founder and CEO of Piracy Strategy Advisors. He served as deputy to the chief of staff of the Kenyan president and an economic advisor to the presidency and the president's Economic and Social Council. We will then turn to Dr. Kevin Carey, who is been a staff member at the World Bank since 2007, and from 2014 to just this year was manager of the macroeconomics and fiscal team covering, that's his current, was lead economist based at the World Bank headquarters covering East Africa, so focused on Kenya, Somalia, Uganda. And then finally we have Tony Carroll, and Tony has been a long-time senior associate and friend of the CSIS Africa Program. He's been working as a commercial lawyer and business consultant. He's on advisory boards from the Exim Bank, OPIC, USTR, very involved in the in AGOA legislation when that first originated, and kind of he's our go-to person on all things trade and economic, who can talk a little bit about the U.S. business perspective on Kenya and East Africa. So we're going to start with Samuel to give us kind of the big picture on kind of the trajectory of Kenya, past and future. Thank you, Samuel.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session on Kenya, discussing the risks and opportunities for East Africa's largest economy. I think my task really is just to sort of shed some light on what underlies the resilience that has been seen in the Kenyan economy over the last 15 years. Ambassador Carson talked about the 2002 election being a watershed event, and it was a watershed event because what happened is that when the government came in, the new government set out to revive an economy that had gone through almost 20 years of severe battering from both internal and external shocks. And what it did then was to figure out, and this is where the technocratic class comes in, how shall we use our internal thinking and internal resources to have not only a short-term view of where the country should go, but to have a long-term view too of where the economy should be heading. And two things came out right at the beginning in early 2003 of the new government, that one, we must have in place what was called an economic recovery strategy, and two, the private sector must play its proper role. And so what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes is how that together has created the boom, if you may call it so, that has produced the Kenya that we're talking about. So in 2003, two very important things happened. The first was that the private sector was asked to come together and begin to speak to the government and conduct its relationship with the government in a unified voice. And this gave birth to what was called the Kenya Private Sector Alliance towards the end of that year. And I'll discuss that later. And just for disclosure purposes, I'm also a trustee of KEPSA, so let me just disclose that as well. The second was the putting together of the economic recovery strategy, which focused on giving the country a sound macroeconomic foundation, just getting all the macroeconomic elements back together, that's inflation, the interest rates, and also managing the fiscal policy. But it also created another instrument that I think was fundamental in the change that we have seen in the country, and that was the National Economic and Social Council, which is a complete innovation for Kenya. And what that did was to put together a body that brought together cabinet, private sector, academia, the top technocrats in government, and international advisors to meet with the president 4 times a year to think about where Kenya should be going. So you have KEPSA, you have the economic recovery strategy, which is the blueprint, and you have a body that brings together the cabinet, together the permanent secretaries who are the highest public officials, and then brings academics and international advisors. And together, these three rails, if I can call them so, began to turn the economy around. And we saw the economy grow from a minus, I think, 0.2% in 2002 to 7% by 2007. And why did that happen? It happened because a lot of confidence was built around this structure, that business has a strong voice, that the government is working in a consultative fashion, and that there's predicability in the kind of policies that are going to come out of this. Now, one would ask, what was different compared to the 1990s? The first step, and this happened serendipitously, was that the government began to focus on finding its own revenue. I don't want to go into a long story as to how that happened, because some of the players, Ambassador Bellamy and other people in the room, know how we found ourselves in that situation. But being faced with the need to find its own revenue, it focused on creating the right environment for the private sector to grow, and that meant that the interest rates and borrowing by government was reduced to such a level that the banks had no choice but to go out and create a private sector credit boom. And what we have seen over that period was that the lending is what revived the private sector, and also the change in a policy that now put private sector at the heart of Kenya's economic growth led to all the sort of innovations that you're talking about. I would say that between the National Economic and Social Council and the Economic Recovery Strategy implementation, all the foundations that you see today, the ICT that led to M-Pesa and that led to M-Shwari and that led to the Silicon Savannah, the growth of the financial sector to create some of the most robust banks in East and Central Africa, some of the most robust insurance companies, the rebirth of the Nairobi Stock Exchange that moved from, its index moved from 1,000 to 4,500 by 2006. All of this came as a result of a renewed confidence in the policies that were being made. But if I could say the thing that created sustainability is that once the economic recovery strategy seemed to have achieved its initial goals, the National Economic and Social Council came up with what was called the Vision 2030, which is what guides the country up to now. And that vision had three pillars. It had an economic pillar, it had a social pillar, and it had a political pillar. And the political pillar essentially focused on changing the constitution and also creating accountable politics. And I think we spent the whole of this morning essentially discussing the elements of that political pillar. The social pillar talked about social cohesion. I think that's a goal that is a work in progress, and we are still trying to work on that as a country to get there. And the economic pillar talked about sustained growth at 10%. The economy has not been able to grow at 10%, but it has achieved 7% and consistently grows between 5 and 6% for the last 10 years. And those three pillars have now survived three governments: the administration, the President Kibaki's administration of 2003 to 2007, the Grand Coalition, 2008 to 2013, and President Uhuru's first administration from 2013 until now, showing that the underlying foundation on which Kenyans economic performance is best is actually resilient, it's capable of adapting to new political leadership, and more importantly, one can plan long-term because there's a long-term direction. I would say that if one was to think of what will help us going forward, and in terms of the risks that I think we are discussing today, if you look at Kenya's economic growth over the last 15 years, you'd see that at every election, the economy takes a dip because of political uncertainty. And in fact, the only election that didn't have that was 2013. But for 2017, because of the prolonged uncertainty, it is very clear to me, and I think to most of us, that there will be a dip. And that dip is as a result of people postponing decisions and waiting for the outcome of these elections since mid-2017, and hoping that on 26th of October, we will finally find a way to go forward. So in conclusion, what I would say, just painting the big picture, is that the foundations of Kenya's economic strength are relatively strong because they run along a strong institutional basis. They're resilient. They can transition from one administration to another. And most of all, they're driven by a very strong working relationship between the government and the private sector, which means that in Kenya, the business community is as strong a development partner as anybody else. Maybe I should end there and then allow the other speakers to continue. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. And that sets a nice frame. We'll turn to you. And having spent 3 years there most recently, you share the kind of optimism for sustained performance.
Yeah, so I wanted to take up where Samuel left off, and on that point about growth, which has been in a pretty steady range between 5 and 7 or 5 and 6. I mean, one thing to say at the outset is this is a very complex economy, and those 1 percentage point changes in growth don't fully capture all of what's going on. And I would make a contrast in particular between Nairobi, the Rift Valley, and the Nairobi-Mombasa corridor, which is where much of the economic activity in the country takes place, compared to the north and east of the country, which is much more exposed to very difficult agricultural climate and has had to absorb really decades of conflict in Somalia and South Sudan. So when we make these kind of statements about the macroeconomy, they're exactly the kind of thing that resonates. But just to put on the table that Kenya deals with a lot besides these fluctuations in growth. Now, the word I would use is exactly the word Samuel used in terms of growth. This is an incredibly resilient economy, and it's resilient because it's diversified, and it's an oil importer, so it has actually gained since 2014 from low oil prices. It was already doing a lot in its domestic energy sector before that, so it was either self-sufficient in some energy sectors or importing, so it's really been well placed in the energy sector. It has tourism, it has commodities. It's a regional hub. I think it's all the things that people know about the economy. I would also point to the informal sector, as a big role of resilience in the in the economy. Kenya has really had an informal sector. Probably people started talking about an informal sector even in the 1960s, and that was because corruption and bureaucracy had already driven activity into this more mode where the government could not interfere with it. That has become a source of strength for the economy. And say M-Pesa, which Samuel mentioned, that was almost a merger of modern technology with the fact that you had a lot of the population that was excluded from traditional means of payment. So you put mobile technology and this informal sector together. You had this then massive breakthrough in technology, which continues to permeate today. So all of those things have really kept going throughout 2017. Certainly, there is uncertainty. There is postponement of investment. It'll be a few months before we'll see how exactly that plays out. But I think for many Kenyans, they're watching the news and waiting to see what happens with the election. But in their day-to-day activities, it's business as usual. In terms of the risks, I would highlight. There are two things that are going to be on the desk of the next government, whichever government it is. One is fiscal consolidation. The budget deficit for the fiscal year 2017, which ended in June, is going to come in at somewhere between 7 and 9% of GDP, and that's an extremely high number. It would be an eye-catching number for any economy, particularly if it comes out around 9%. Now, Kenya has the headroom. Kenya has market access. Kenya is able to finance a deficit of, let's say, if it comes out at 8% of GDP. But I don't think you need, much of a qualification in macroeconomics to know budget deficits of 8% of GDP cannot go on indefinitely. The government's rationale has always been standard gauge railway and some other big one-off projects have driven up the deficit. As they are completed, the deficit will come back down. But it's a difficult environment to do a fiscal consolidation, partly because of the jobs and poverty issues that you mentioned at the start. So one thing that the new government will have to be clear on is how are they going to get the budget deficit down to a more manageable number. One of the advantages they have is the revenue mobilization that Samuel talked about. This is a fairly advanced tax system by sub-Saharan African standards. A very well-established value-added tax, corporate income tax, personal income tax. So that they have the instruments, but they may be close to the limit already of how much they can do on the tax side. So there is going to have to be a component involving spending cuts. And of course, the election itself is adding expenses, the rerun of the election and the expenses associated with that. The second big headache for the incoming government is the interest rate cap. And I think those of you who follow the country will know what this is. It is by law, it is a floor on deposit rates and a ceiling on lending rates that banks can charge. It's a 4 percentage point difference between the floor and the ceiling. So it's really been squeezing banks on one side on their cost of funds because they have to pay relatively more on deposits, but especially on the lending side, it curtails their ability to charge the interest rates that they might need to compensate for risk. Now, it's important to emphasize this was a popular measure in Kenya. It had a lot of support in Parliament and still has a lot of support in Parliament. And to be fair, I think some of the media coverage in Kenya has been saying, you guys in Washington didn't understand this. You said it was going to be a disaster, and it was not, at least so far. But it is constraining banks' room for maneuver. Banks, it's a strong banking sector, but they need that flexibility to price deposits and loans given the conditions that they face. There's been indications from the central bank of Kenya that they want that interest rate cap to go and are expecting it to happen quite soon, but it will not be an easy thing for a government, coming in now, after a runoff election, and facing maybe probably already perhaps some uncertainty due to the slowdown in the economy, and then to have to go to the Parliament with what will be an unpopular proposal on interest rate liberalisation. So I think they're the two things that will have to be challenged and will make it difficult for after October, whoever is in power. Let me stop there for now, Jennifer.
Let's turn to Tony to talk about the U.S. perspective. One thing I meant to mention in my intro, and perhaps we can come back to this, is kind of the role of external investors and the region. I mean, if you look far ahead in Kenya, I mean, it's kind of the tail end of the One Belt, China's One Belt. And, you know, if you look 20 years ahead, you know, does the Indian Ocean become kind of the new center of trade, which positions Kenya and the infrastructure investments that are being made there, puts it in a very good place and dynamic place. And, you know, is the U.S. going to be at the table on some of those? And so, Tony, I wonder if maybe you can talk a little bit about the U.S. Business perspective.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's an honor to be here and follow up on the type of leadership we've shown in Kenya and commitment to Kenya as Ambassadors Bellamy and Carson and previously Ambassador Yates in the audience. We've always considered Kenya an important country, and I'm glad that we still continue to see Kenya as an important country. So our relationship, I think, will endure and withstand these vicissitudes that happen from time to time. It's a great relationship. And let me underscore that by saying what Hank Cohen, who's a deep friend of mine and a mentor of many of the people in this room, always said, that when we ever ask Kenya to do something in terms of security and counterterrorism, they were always the first to say yes. So we have a strong security relationship with Kenya. It's an enduring one. It's an ally that we can count on. I remember we talked a little bit about diversification of economy. I was on my way as a Peace Corps volunteer to Botswana in 1976, and I stopped in Kenya on the way. And talk about contrast in economies of diversification. I was really stunned to see Kenya have manufacturing and, you know, a terrific services sector even back then. And when I went to Botswana, which was in 1976, Botswana's come an awful long way since 1976, as we all know, but it was probably the least diversified economy in the world. So Kenya has built upon a diverse economic base for the many, many years. And I think the last thing I'm going to say, because I've not only worked in the economic and business space, I've also had some involvement in the political space. I was chairman of the ABA Africa Law Committee. I'm a founder of Kutua wa Sharia. I practice law with Mukisa Kitui, not with Mukisa Kitui, with Salim Danji, and have many good friends in the legal community. But I remember once going to Justice Chisoni's office. Some of you remember Justice Chisoni. He was the Electoral Commission chair. And he had two phones on his desk. One of them was Amos Wako's line as Attorney General, and the other was Nicholas Biwott. So if he ever had to do something, he got the instructions from State House, either through Amos Wako or through Nicholas Biwott, about what to do. So we've come a long ways in the sweep of time in terms of electoral commission independence. So those of you who remember the wars of 1992, am I right on that? Anyway, let me just point out a few highline points here. As a business person, I've advised businesses in Kenya for 30-odd years. As Kevin pointed out and Samuel pointed out, the growth rate in Kenya has been steady. It's predicted to be 5.4% this year, and contrast that to South Africa, which is less than 1%. Kenya is a non-oil exporting country. It's a diversified economy. It goes from strength to strength. Kenya wasn't mentioned as the leading investor now. It surpassed South Africa, the leading investor into sub-Saharan Africa among African countries. So Kenya has really stepped forth to be a platform for foreign direct investment into Africa, and it's a third or a fourth the size of South Africa's GDP. So that shows you that the Kenyans are very much engaged with external investment, and companies in the United States are going to Kenya and accessing the market. Kenya is the engine of growth in the East Africa community for sure. I remember one time looking at some talking points for Secretary Clinton when we were down at the AGOA Forum in Kenya about 8 years ago, and we saw from year to year there's been like a 23% increase in foreign investment within the EAC. That has certainly been driven by Kenya, its institutions, and so forth. What we haven't seen, and I've written about this in South Africa's Business Day just earlier this year, is we really haven't seen much growth, and as much growth has been needed in trade integration, because we have still resistance from many of the economies within the EAC to fully opening up their borders. I'm not going to go and point out which of those economies are, but I think many of you know which one I'm talking about particularly. Kenya's been the second leading country in Africa in exporting to the United States, non-oil producing country. So they only trail South Africa in their exports to the United States. South Africa has been a leader in textiles and apparel to the United States. They've been the leading beneficiary, along with Lesotho, in the textile front, but they have a more diversified economy, and certainly we've seen the benefit of that in our trade relationship, and also Kenya is a good market for U.S. goods and services. We have a pretty healthy trade relationship with Kenya in both importing and exporting. We've seen some swings from time to time, post-2008, some large purchases from Kenya Airways of Boeing aircraft and so forth. But we've had a pretty steady and good trade relationship with Kenya. We haven't seen an enormous inequality in that. So it's a good market for goods and services. Kenya remains a gateway to East Africa. Take a look at GE. GE could have centered its African operations anywhere. It centered them in Kenya because of good transportation access, reliable institutions, good labor force, skilled, talented people. Innovation is a benchmark of Kenya, and I think companies like GE see that. We talked about the innovation with M-Pesa and the Silicon Savannah. Kenya has been in the lead, certainly in the lead across Africa in developing the use of ICT. It has leading institutions, banks, financial capital markets, technical services, logistics firms. Certainly, Kenya is by far the most diverse in that area. They also, one thing it's pointed out that, I teach about this in my course at CSIS, which I co-teach with David Throop, who's one of the real experts on Kenya, is what we've noticed is Kenya's, Kevin has pointed this out, Kenya's increased ability to be able to fund its own, government services. So about 85% of Kenya's revenue comes from domestic tax sources, and therefore they're less dependent upon the whims and wishes of the development community. Now, what does that mean as a business person? It means that they're not going to be penalized, or there's a certain steady consistency to Kenyans. They're more independent and self-reliant upon that. One other thing, Kenya is a growing consumer market. 70%, for example, of Kenyans get their health care from the private sector. Varian, a U.S. company in the medical technology space, is working with a group of Indian hospitals. They're building 24 hospitals in Kenya. These are for-pay services. You're starting to see the growth of the insurance market in Kenya. So we're starting to see a real modernization of the health sector. The Kenyan government's never going to be able to meet all the needs of Kenyans in terms of health. And I think the Kenyans have recognized that the private sector is going to play a leading role. It's always been a good venue for, let's see, and let me just point out a few things here that I recently asked a big investor and business person in Kenya what he thought some of the challenges in and around the election and opportunities. But before that, I want to take a look at where Kenya stands from a business perspective on the doing business measures. That I think will underscore some of the points that we're making here. First of all, Kenya is the second most diversified economy in Africa as measured by the MIT measure of economic diversification. So only after South Africa, Kenya offers a greater range of economic and financial activity. In the Doing Business survey of 2016 from the World Economic Forum, Kenya ranks the problems that Kenya still confront in terms of the business enabling environment include corruption, tax rates, access to financing, we talked a little bit about banking, inefficient government bureaucracy, inadequate supply of infrastructure, policy instability. And I think you'd be fair to say that policy instability certainly includes having an awful lot of elections, because you just don't know what's going to happen from period to period. So I think that we have to take a look at that the instability of the elections is also being a contributing factor to business uncertainty. And then the Kenya economic performance in terms of various measures, where Kenya is performing very well relative to the world, not just Africa, and where it needs to be increasingly competitive. The areas where Kenya does very well are labor market efficiency, where it ranks 31st out of 144 countries surveyed in the world. So labor efficiency is one of the real highlights. Other high areas are business sophistication, innovation, financial market development. Those are the strongest areas where Kenya is performing. The weakest areas and measures that I think no Kenyan would really want to tolerate is Kenya ranks 122nd out of 144th in macroeconomic environment. And I think that really pertains to the inconsistency of regulation and constraints on doing business. Where it also performs very poorly is in health and primary education, where it ranks 115th out of 144. And one that's sort of surprising, in higher education and training, Kenya ranks 97th out of 144. There's still improvements that can be made. I think one of the problems is that if we're so focused on the short-term political, we often lose sight of some of these institutional reforms that we have to continue to push the envelope on. And then just lastly, where I think there are opportunities and some challenges from my foreign investor. He said that investment and spending in the last 6 to 8 months are down, in his estimate, about 30% because of uncertainty in the election. He says, as a good example, a company that many our Kenyans here would know about was about to sign off on a large property development. It was a Dubai investor, and it was the day of just before the courts decided to overturn the election, and then they walked away from the deal saying, well, you sort this out, we'll come back. So there's been some uncertainty in the foreign investment community. Inflation, he thinks, is bumped up. If it got to double digit, it could create a lot of problems, and it also complicates the restrictions on lending if we see an inflationary environment come up. So that could be a problem. And then, terrorism is an issue. I think we're not immune to the fact that it's in a dangerous neighborhood. We've just recently celebrated the 4th anniversary of a horrific terrorist attack in Nairobi. This is an environment that is still pervasive in the region, and we have to be mindful of that, and foreign investors are certainly also informed or at least affected by that. Some opportunities, he thinks. Kenyans have banned plastic bags, and the rumor is that they're going to ban plastic bottles. Therefore, it may create an opportunity for recycling that could come up. Toll roads are now been approved to facilitate the development of road infrastructure. That could be an opportunity. Power we've talked about. The Kenyans are probably among the more visionary in terms of allowing both innovation and also private sector involvement. Airlines is a good and bad story. Kenyan Airways is still suffering, but there's still a growing demand for air services in the country, and that can open up the opportunity for private service. In fact, I think there's a company now that's got some contracts with Boeing 737s, private suppliers. And then, the growth of the fast-moving consumer good market. Kenya's middle class is growing. The retail sector is growing, and I think that's going to be continued from year in and year out. So on balance, Kenya is a great place to do business. It's certainly, I think there needs to be continue pushing on the liberalization and reform of the business climate, but it certainly is a place that one can profitably do business and work with good partners and find good services and institutions in which to avail yourselves to ensure that your investment is both secure and profitable.
Great. Thank you. Well, that's a very positive outlook for the country. I'm wondering, and it goes back to a point that Kevin made on kind of the regional disparities in the economy, and it's a bit like Nigeria, where you have a very concentrated, southwest hub of economic activity. The Lapset corridor was one of the things that was held up as, a massive infrastructure across the north that would integrate regional integration, port, rail, pipeline, and so forth. And that would really open up the northern economy in a big way. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about where that stands, but just more broadly, any of the panelists on kind of on those regional disparities and national economic integration as well as regional economic integration.
Yeah, so just briefly, I think the Northeast is always going to be hampered by what it's next to. When it's next to Somalia and next to South Sudan, and no particular reason to be optimistic for in either situation. I think that's always going to be a difficulty. The government is certainly focused on the Northeast. There is a Northeast development program, lots of different investments that are envisaged there, and Lamu Port is happening. People who've been there said, forget talking about it. When you go there, the work is already being done to build that port, and I think it's related to some of the One Belt, One Road ambitions that you talked about before. Now, I think the immediate obstacle that LAPSET faces is, and it goes to some of the East African community politics that Tony was talking about. You know, the vision was meant to be that oil would be coming out there either from South Sudan or Uganda. Uganda has decided that the pipeline route will be through Tanzania rather than through Kenya. It remains to be seen whether that investment can actually be delivered, but for the time being, it has taken away part of the rationale. And then South Sudan, the oil sector there is deeply troubled, and we really don't know what are the arrangements that they have with Khartoum for oil export, and that makes it very difficult to think about an alternative route. But nevertheless, the way I view it is the port is definitely going to happen, and it may be that as Kenya starts to show that it has facts on the ground, that and if things stall with some of the other initiatives, then it could be reinstated. One other thing I would just say on the Northeast. It was exposed to, and still is exposed to drought and the impact that had on the maize market. So besides some of the longer term development issues there, I think the government, suffered a little bit from a perception that it was too late to move on importing maize, compared to other countries in the region, with the effect that the price of maize, went higher than perhaps it could have if there'd been a more proactive importing policy. So if you compare, for example, to Malawi, where there was, severe shortage of maize, but a very aggressive import policy that actually succeeded in keeping the price of maize down. That's just to say, for the people in the Northeast, certainly the investment projects, the long-term investment projects are important, but they would also have strong interest in just immediate, making sure the government has very effective immediate relief mechanisms for drought. That's making sure that maize is distributed, that animals can be purchased before they have to be slaughtered for lack of water, and so on. The government certainly made efforts in that area, but I think it didn't help over the summer that there was a perception that they were slow to move, and that really matters for livelihoods of people in the Northeast.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. I think, in my view, yes, we live in a tough neighborhood. I mean, a very tough one. But we're also very good at figuring out how to live in that neighborhood. And there is a strategic shift that is happening slowly in reorienting LAPSET, and whereby initially I think a lot of emphasis was on South Sudan. Now the emphasis is on Ethiopia. And you may know that the road has been completed between Isiolo and Ethiopia, and you can already see the difference that that road has made, not only in northern Kenya, but also in southern Ethiopia. The port is under construction, and the road between Lamu and Isiolo, I think, has been contracted and will soon be built, and the whole structure is readjusted to reality. But the thing is that the country of Kenya is an accidental outcome of the lunatic railway, It was called the Lunatic Express. I mean, the British came to build a railway to go to Uganda and found a lot of good land and good climate in between and settled there, and that became Kenya. And if you look at the economic concentration and of activity, it's basically 150 miles along the railway. So the whole concept of LAPSET was to create another development corridor and create another Kenya up there. And I think it may go a bit slowly, but it's going to happen. The second thing is, in the next 5 to 10 years, as much as it's been a blessing not to have a strong extractive sector, we will now have an extractive sector, because some of the oil finds will come on stream, maybe depending on the oil prices. Some of the gas will come on stream, but also the minerals. There's quite a bit of minerals now which is dispersed around the country, and I think in the last 5 years it's been a sense of what do we do with these minerals. And what has happened is that there's more and more development of the right policy and institutional framework to avoid the Dutch disease and to avoid what has happened to other economies. And maybe we may see those minerals come on board. But for me, the greatest promise of dealing with inequalities is devolution. For a long time, the country had one economic center, maybe 1.5, Nairobi and Mombasa. Now, well worked, we would have 47 economic centers. So we disperse economic, social, and other opportunity to the counties. And these county governments, as they become stronger and more effective, will strengthen the areas that may look like they've suffered in the past from neglect. And I can see maybe 20 years from now, the country looking very different. You will still have a very dynamic Nairobi, you still have a very dynamic Mombasa, but they'll have a much smaller share of the national GDP because that will have been spread to the other counties.
Just a couple of finer points here. I think it's fair to say that Kenya has probably among the most investor-friendly mineral mining laws in all of Africa. They really have gone out of their way to try to understand the interests and motivations of the investors, and to their great credit, they've done that. I think talking a little bit about the regional context, one of the problems with these economic communities is that there's various levels of ambition among their members in terms of integration. I think in the case of Kenya and Rwanda, you have two countries that have a very ambitious vision of their relationship, trading and economic relationship with their neighbors. And then you have a country that is very suspicious of its trading relationships with its neighbors, Tanzania, right now, which I think is right now going through an uncertain period of leadership. Uganda's sort of a foot in and a foot out. They see the relationship, but there's always been an awful lot of envy in Uganda about Kenya. And then Burundi is sort of that appendix at the end that always seems to give you problems. It's one of those small, it's less than 4 or 5% of the regional economy, but it seems to always be in turmoil. So it's a problem, let alone you add the uncertain accession of South Sudan into the East Africa community, which is going to create maybe another range of problems. I will not comment on that, but it's going to be complicated. But let me, I take sort of the Bill Easterly school of letting things organically grow rather than large state projects driving economies, and I think that's, with all due respect to the World Bank, I tend to try to be more on the side of organic, homegrown growth than large project-driven growth. And I think there was I couldn't get my hands on the analysis, but I read within the last 3 or 4 months a comparison of a study between Kenya and Ethiopia. Ethiopia certainly deserves a lot of credit for having achieved what I saw in 1992 and where it is now in terms of its absolute level of development. Yet that development is very much in the form of a developmental state, and you have a large state engagement with the economy across the board. You're seeing new jobs and you're seeing investment, but you're not seeing a lot of ground-up organic growth because they haven't yet liberalized their economy to allow that to happen. Kenya, on the other hand, has a much deeper and more organically driven domestic sort of growth model. And I think if I'm a big friend of both countries and have experience, an extensive experience in both, but I think that the model that Kenya has of being able to have a more organic, domestically led, not state developmental approach to development is, to me, one that's going to be a longer and truer model of development.
Let's take some questions from the room. I'll put my glasses on. We'll take a few and then come back to the panel. We'll go to the gentleman here on the aisle, and then the lady.
Thank you very much. Marvelous conversation. I'm Peter Matlin with Cornell University. All of you have underlined the very impressive progress Kenya has made over the last 15 years or so in terms of macroeconomic growth. I'd like you to discuss a little bit more in terms of how broadly this progress is being shared across the population. Could you provide some indicators of inequality and trends in inequality? Could you also provide some indicators from the human development spheres of poverty reduction, food security improvements, child mortality? I think this would give us a much richer sense of what is actually occurring in terms of true development, not just economic growth. And the final point, closely related, is what's happening in terms of employment indicators. Again, trends of underemployment, unemployment, with a particular focus on the youth, those under 25. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Paula Bond. I work with a nonprofit which operates in Kenya with the Maasai tribe. My question actually builds off of yours, which is regarding the distribution of wealth. I'm wondering specifically, given the sustained growth year on year and given the diversification of the economy and now the potentially greater centers of growth within the country, how many people have actually moved out from underneath the poverty line into the middle class? Tony mentioned that it was growing. And also, what is being done for those who live below the extreme poverty line? Dr. Kevin was mentioning some things which are being done in the Northeast. I'm wondering, at a more national level, be they in urban centers or with pastoralist societies such as the Maasai, what is being done specifically in the face of the drought, the severe drought which the country is facing right now, which is wiping out a lot of their livelihood? What is being done to help those communities?
Thank you. Good morning. My name's Phil Thomas. I'm an adjunct professor at George Mason University across the river, run the Global Food Security Project. And one of the concerns I have is that there's been a lot of emphasis on hunger and poverty in Kenya. Even though Kenya is doing well from a commercial perspective, there are these serious pockets of food insecurity. The U.S. government has targeted Kenya as one of its 19 global food security countries, now down to, I think, 12 or 13 under the Global Food Security Act that was passed last year. We're looking at Kisumu County in the Seme sub-province and questions about significant hunger and poverty there and a failure of the government to act responsibly, despite large amounts of U.S. food assistance. The other question is, you talk about the private sector. Has there been an effort to deal with the NGO community and to link the NGO community with the government and the private sector in private-public partnerships? We're pushing this in terms of food security, and we were wondering whether you see this growing in Kenya. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christopher, and I work with Red Genomics as a Strategic Alliance Project Manager and also a student at Cogwood School of Business as a Master of Data Analytics. My question to the panel is about Kenya's debt. And we know that Kenya's debt has doubled in the last 5 years to be almost half of Kenya's GDP. It's almost 4 trillion Kenya shillings. My question is, what is the National Economic and Social Council trying to do while working with the government to try and limit the impact of what that debt is, especially not just with this current generation, but in the years to come? And also a cascading question, which is not related, is what is your assessment of brain drain on the economy currently and in the future? Thank you.
So we have 3 questions that really get at the development versus growth and equity issues, equality issues, food security, and then the question on debt and brain drain. So should we start with you? And
yeah, so briefly, to the questions on income distribution, it's fair to say we've been a little bit flying blind in terms of knowing what's been happening to income distribution over the last 10 years, and that's due to the lack of a household income and expenditure survey that would allow us to do the normal kind of analysis to know what's going on. So what we've been doing is working with the mid-2000s, around 2006, Kenya National Bureau of Statistics Household Income and Expenditure Survey, and really trying to extrapolate from that what we think is happening to poverty and income distribution now. Now, Kenya has changed a lot in the last 10 years. So you do have a concern using an older household survey. How accurate are the statements that are being made from it? So I'll finish with the good news, which is that the KNBS has completed a new household survey, which is being analysed right now, and towards the end of the year, we're going to have much more definitive answers of what's actually been happening in the last 10 years. Now, the broad brush would be, our current estimate of absolute poverty in Kenya, which again is really extrapolation from the older survey rather than new estimate. Around 1/3 of Kenyans live in absolute poverty, and that's by the World Bank measure, that's $1.90 per day. Now, you've all walked around here seeing these anti-World Bank poverty line ads, comparing it. Why are we using less than a price of a tall latte at Starbucks as the poverty line? That's a separate issue. But by that standard measure of absolute poverty, it's around 1/3, which is high. And it goes to this question here about food security. Even with what's close now to 15 years of impressive growth and continued diversification, many Kenyans are poor and some are hungry. So that'd be my answer at this stage. In 2 months, I think we'll know a lot more. Some of the food security issues, I think, are nutrition issues. So even when and we see this actually across East Africa, that even when there is, say, if the diet is dependent on maize, white maize that hasn't been fortified in any way, it's just not that great. It's not that great a diet. So I think it's a matter of both food aid, but also work that needs to happen domestically to make what's still a pretty cheap diet a little bit more nutritious than it is. Finally, on debt, you're right. It's about half of GDP. Now, by the thresholds that the World Bank and IMF use to assess acceptable debt levels for a country like Kenya, the threshold for when, say, the red light starts blinking is more around 75% than 54%, where it is now. But just as, when you're driving, we don't encourage you to go all the way up to the speed limit. No one would be telling Kenya to go all the way to 75 and then start worrying about, the level of debt. It needs to come down. It needs to at least stabilize very soon, and it needs to happen partly through the fiscal consolidation that I was talking about before, but also the growth that will reduce that level of debt as a burden of GDP. I'll stop there.
Great. Sam and Tony, I wonder particularly if you might say, where are the growth, expanded employment opportunities going to come from? What's that going to look like? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's one of the hardest questions. Employment creation has been very, very tough. I think if anybody was going to be honest about the growth and development model that we have had in the country, one of the weak spots has been how do you create meaningful employment, particularly as you continue to educate many more young people and create further expectations of them being able to do good jobs. That has been tough. And in my view, I would think, and I know that there's been movement in that direction, that we must follow the path that any other country that has gone up the food chain has followed, which is to move to sectors such as manufacturing and go maybe the South Asian, Bangladesh, Vietnamese way of linking or plugging Kenya into the global supply chain in terms of industries, textiles, and so on. And in the last 2 years, the government put together the Special Economic Zone Authority. It put together the law, has designated the special economic zones, and the whole premise was that after these elections, those zones would come into effect. And that is expected to deal with part of the employment creation So unemployment for youth, high. This is, of course, a result also of the population growth. And I would even say that some of the things that we're talking about in terms of food insecurity, distribution of wealth and opportunity have got many other fundamental structural elements. For instance, the culture of subdividing land creates in the long term food insecurity, because what happens is that if each generation results in smaller and smaller land being available, less and less food is actually grown at home. And if you went to one of the counties, which was once called the granary of Kenya, that had large, expansive farms and some of the best production, today it's been reduced to small patches of land. And in that land, you find 2 or 3 generations living there, and it's a mix of homes, cemetery, and food production, which makes it much more difficult in the future to see how that land's productivity is going to go up. So the real future for the country is a hard one, which is industrialization and urbanization. Unless those 2 trajectories get traction and move a significant, if not most of the population, out of the farmlands into urban areas, into largely industrial, reasonable paying jobs, I think that these inequalities will not be dealt with in a manner that is satisfactory. About the debt, I think it's been well answered. The main issue is maybe the composition of the debt. For a long time, Kenya depended on grants and concessionary aid. Now we've gone into commercial debt. And I think the commercial debt is becoming a larger proportion of that debt. So really what we have to look at is what are the terms of that commercial debt and how will this affect the ability of the country to pay in the future. But given the very, very, very effective revenue collection system that is in place, I think I would say I would not worry, but I would put it at orange. Don't wait to get to red before you take the action. Where we are, the orange, the amber light needs to come on and say, let's be careful as to how this debt is being contracted and how it's going to be managed in the future. About the brain drain on the economy, I think maybe there's a flip on that. There's a sort of a joke that goes around in some circles of Nairobi that there's a San Franciscan diaspora in Nairobi. Oh yes, because of the opportunities in ICT. There are lots and lots of startups. And now you have, I've met many of them for dinners and lunches. People have moved out of San Francisco to come and see if they can do something. In Kenya, you've got lots of Kenyans who are in the diaspora coming back home. And so for me, I see a Kenya that is becoming more and more of a global nation, and sometimes some brains go out, some brains come in, and eventually it will balance out. So I think we shouldn't worry too much about that. And finally, on the NGOs, how can they come in the private-public partnership? For a long time, the partnership has been based largely on private sector and government because that seems natural, because civil society, just by its very own construct, is supposed to question government rather than work with it. So I think maybe that's a work in progress. It hasn't quite gotten there, and I can say I don't have a specific answer as to how that would happen, except that on areas like land, and I think there are a few NGOs that are working in public-private partnership with the government to make sure that all the schools get the title deeds. So at least you can see that partnership on the nexus between a very important socio-economic issue and government policy and regulations, then NGOs can come at that part. So I think the partnership would have a different texture and a different sort of basis. So it would be a PPP that between government and civil society on socioeconomic issues, and the PPPs then between business and government would probably go to the productive sector. So you might see those parallel tracks, but we can still call them PPPs. Thank you.
Just a point on that. Think tanks are NGOs too, and so not every NGO needs to be adversarial. And there's a lot of constructive, creating kind of a constructively engaged civil society important. Tony, do you want to say something on this?
Just a couple of quick points here. Look, there's been an evolution in Kenya that's happening elsewhere in Africa from rural to urban areas, and that is certainly not only to Nairobi, but in secondary cities. You're seeing a lot of growth in the secondary cities of Kenya. Sort of neutral statement, people that live in cities do better per capita income, living levels are higher. That means there's more diversification and more opportunities for employment generation. Look, I think we always look for the silver bullet with a new industry coming in, a new special economic zone. I worked with Silas Ita in the development of the first Kenya free zones back, the EPZs, ages ago. And I think they're a solution, but I think the most employment growth is going to be from below, from the small and medium enterprise sector. And I think you've got to focus on letting and trying to let and free up that sector from growing. I think the banking restrictions are going to be a constraint on small, because, you know, when you make a bank restriction like that and try to limit credit, the people that you're trying to help are the people that are most impacted and hurt by these type of restrictions, because the banks aren't going to lend to people if the rates that they're going to be, you know, looking at are really uneconomic for them. Ukisa Kitui, who is a brilliant guy, former trade minister, now the Secretary General of UNCTAD, has created a relationship with Jack Ma, who we all know is perhaps one of the great visionaries in the world in terms of business. And the idea there is Jack Ma wants to use all of his energies and powers to accelerate value chains in Africa so that small and medium enterprises can start trading in the global economy. You know what's going to help facilitate that is building infrastructure and allowing logistics and the flow of goods in and out of Kenya. So watch that space. Jack Ma was up in New York this week talking about that. Mukisa Kitui has been very involved in that. I think Kenya is sort of the test case where that can happen.
Getting very close on time. We'll take two brief questions, one here. Okay, and we'll let our guests a very brief and very quick answers from the panel.
Okay, hi, I'm Mindy Reiser. I'm a sociologist, and I'm vice president of the NGO Works in Peacebuilding and Conflict Resolution. And I earlier worked for the Council for International Exchange of Scholars, which leads to my question about higher education and where it's going in terms of training people in Kenya for the economy of the 21st century. There once upon a time, and still probably is, an organization of African universities. Does anyone know what they're up to? What about consortia of African universities to develop a kind of critical infrastructure of faculty who could teach advanced courses in different technologies? It seems to me the statistics are quite upsetting in terms of the low level of higher education as gauged by this MIT study. So say something about where we're going with education in Kenya to meet the needs. More people are coming in, but it sounds like the quality isn't very good.
And then right in front of you, you can pass the mic to Korea.
Thank you very much. Actually, just to have one or two input in relation to income distribution and addressing the most vulnerable in our population. I think one of the programs government has come up with is a massive social program, social protection program targeting especially the aged and orphans and vulnerable children across the country. Over the last 3 years now, government has invested a substantial amount of resources, of public sector resources, targeting about 3 million people that are receiving on a monthly basis cash transfer directly through, a mobile infrastructure in the region of about $20 to $30 on a monthly basis, basically, just to add on to what they already have. The second piece in terms of employment creation, I want to really submit that one of the things government is focused on is this problem around an aging problem around agriculture. We're dealing with the cohort of farmers in Kenya right now. The average age of a farmer in Kenya is about 65 years. Now, how can we ensure food security and food sustainability unless we get more youth involved in agriculture? And so there's a huge program currently underway in terms of trying to get young people to be involved in agriculture, in addition to also trying to really modernize the imperatives, around agriculture. I think those are the two inputs I had.
Okay.
So, thank you.
I was a big fan of Shamba Shake Up. I don't know if you remember that TV show that was kind of redo your farm with modern technologies. Let's start with Tony and come back. We really have the education question, but any wrap-up thoughts that you have as well?
Well, on the education factor, I don't really have much to say other than the statistics and surveys that I've seen show that Kenya has a more capable labor workforce than most other countries in the region. I do have a special interest in the growth, the development of higher education in Africa. I sit on the board of advisors at the University of Wisconsin, and we've been doing a lot of work internationally and in Africa and trying to develop linkages. And I think the land-grant universities have special skills to bring to the African context. And Indiana has a relationship with Moy University, which is doing quite well. So I think we need to be more ambitious in terms of fostering these relationships. All of us who remember going to Kenya in the 70s and seeing, Makerere University, going to Ife, and seeing really terrific, universities of a world class that had enormous number of exchanges with U.S. universities, are disheartened to go back. Read Paul Thoreau's revisit to his former faculty at Makerere University and Dark Star Safari, and one can only shudder at what has happened in the decline of higher education. But if you go to Stellenbosch, and you see their engagement in almost like a land-grant university in maritime fishing and looking at food storage and all these things, I think Kenya is probably one of the few countries where you could develop a greater, more robust, research-based university system. And I would urge, because I think there's real payoff to that in that investment, I urge that the Kenyans take a look at where they can grow into that research university space. Because, that's going to provide the engine for innovative investment as well.
I wanted to come back to the HDI. It's just last week I was speaking to a forum and saying it's the most underused index, I think. There's a lot of emphasis on ease of doing business. People look at all the other rankings, but they seem to have some, I would say, maybe some hesitancy to really use the HDI as a measure of growth, because it's a very complex and it moves very slowly. The needle hardly moves for countries over a long term. But what I was telling that audience is that really, if you really want to know where your country is going, you should actually be looking at your HDI and what is changing in those elements, because then it tells you that those are fundamental changes, that the country can't go down, it can only go up. So, and maybe economists should pay a lot more attention to those elements in terms of the development discourse. So I hope that becomes an important indicator for many people. Higher education, I'm not very familiar with this, but I think that the challenge is it's very hard for people to conceptualize how the 21st century is going to look like. All the traditional jobs seem to be disappearing. We had someone speak to us from India. He's the founder of one of the biggest telecom companies there. And what he was saying is that in the next 10 to 20 years, both India and Africa may face catastrophic unemployment because they're not prepared for a future in which so many jobs will be taken away by digital and other technologies, and universities and primary schools and high schools are churning out people for the 20th century. And the 21st century looks so different from the 20th. So I hope that our continent is thinking about it. And I can say that for Kenya, it's been looked at the foundational level. There's a digital education program for what we call primary school. I think you'd call them elementary school children, whereby there's a policy objective to raise an entire generation who are digitally educated from the age of 6 years, from first grade all the way. So over the next 20 years, I think when this project is completed, you'll have a totally different labor force than the one that we have now. And maybe that will prepare the country for the 21st century. But you still face the problem that you've got all these older kids that never went through that. And what do you do with them? What do you do with all this redundant labor?
Just really quickly on the cash transfers, I think the challenge throughout Africa has been cash transfer programs are often seen initially as something that donors like to do rather than governments like to do. I mean, I think the good news in Kenya is it's been embraced by the government, and the test is often in other countries after donors lose interest in these programs and stop funding them. Does the government continue to embrace them? The signs are they will, unlike in other countries. For example, Ethiopia, much of the social safety net in Ethiopia is funded by donors, and it's not at all clear that the government would actually take it on as its own expense. One final thing, I mean, I think some of the urbanization issues, some of the agriculture issues that we were talking about, there's no escaping the fact that land, there are serious issues with how land is managed and just the bureaucracy and administration around land in Kenya. One thing that always struck me, being there is in most cities, when you drive around, you see signs saying site for sale. Nairobi is where I had to get used to the fact you see a sign, this site not for sale. And it tells you there are lots and lots of people out there representing themselves as owners of land that they don't own, and a title system that's not capable of figuring that out. And that is an issue. It goes back to this titling for schools as well. When you don't have clarity about where your building is or what you're standing on, I mean, that has to be a big impediment to development. So I think if I was to leave you with one thought, it would be a lot more effort needed on that.
Thank all of you for staying through the conference, and thank our panel for a really excellent discussion. I mean, what comes across to me here is kind of what is at stake in Kenya. Yes, it is a resilient economy, but political uncertainty and certainly, a protracted political uncertainty can have a huge impact. Just reflecting back on this morning's discussions of the court, and first, I think the credibility and the impartiality of the judicial system is the best guarantee that the problem is not taken to the streets. And so I think it's a big step forward that the court came forward and demonstrated its impartiality and its independence from the incumbent regime, which will make it much less likely that you can make a case for taking to the streets rather than through the judicial process coming forward. I do remember in the early 2000s working on Kenya, a lot of Kenyans would complain, the U.S. has such a double standard for Kenya. They want so much, they expect, look at, Uganda next door, or look at Angola, or look at Zimbabwe, and so forth. And, the fact is, to those to whom much is given, much is expected. And I think we always have expected more of Kenya and in the democracy community because there is so much going for it. And, you talk about, the planning, the entrepreneurial, the bottom-up growth, the technocratic, the civil society, strength of civil society, the strength of judiciary. I mean, Kenya has so much going for it, and I think, that's why we're very concerned, and that's why I think everyone here at the conference is really rooting for Kenya to get through this particular glitch and kind of maximize its potential in the years to come. So thank you all for joining with us, and thank you to Mark Bellamy for really pulling this together along with Richard Downey and Katrin Hager. I just kind of showed up, and Tony Carroll, who and really all of our excellent panelists today. So thank you very much, and we're adjourned.